In front of everyone he loved, my husband ordered me to apologize or walk out. He forgot I had emptied my entire life savings to clear his $82,000 debt just 6 months earlier. When the actual bank statement hit the dining room table, his mother turned pale and whispered 5 words that destroyed his world. He lied to us all. Before I tell you exactly how I exposed his ultimate betrayal, if you believe that toxic family members need to be held accountable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments which state or country you are watching from and what time it is right now. Now let me take you back to the Sunday dinner where my marriage shattered. My name is Clara. I am 31 years old, and I work as a medical billing auditor for a major regional hospital network in Ohio. My daily professional life revolves around finding missing numbers, tracking down inconsistencies in complex financial records, and holding people accountable for fraud. I am exceptionally good at my job. I see the truths that people try to bury under layers of paperwork. But for a very long time, I was completely blind to the massive, glaring inconsistencies in my own marriage. I grew up navigating the foster care system. I lost both of my parents in a terrible highway accident when I was only 5 years old. Because of that profound loss, all I ever truly wanted in life was a real family. When I met Thomas 3 years ago, I thought I had finally found my safe harbor. He was incredibly charming. He owned a high-end landscaping business, and his family seemed like something pulled straight out of a classic television show. His mother, Barbara, hosted traditional Sunday dinners after church every single week without fail. His younger sister, Jessica, was the golden child who could do no wrong. I wanted so desperately to belong to them, to be accepted into their perfect circle, that I willingly ignored every single red flag waving right in front of my face. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, exactly the kind of dreary gray day that makes you want to stay warm and quiet inside. We were all gathered around Barbara's heavily polished mahogany dining table. The rich smell of roasted lamb and buttered carrots filled the room, masking the underlying tension that always seemed to exist when I was around. Barbara was wearing her usual Sunday best, a perfectly pressed floral blouse and a string of genuine pearls. She poured sweet iced tea into expensive crystal glasses, making subtle, passive-aggressive comments about how the pie I had brought was a little too tart for her liking. Jessica sat directly across from me, loudly tapping her manicured acrylic nails against the pristine tablecloth. I was deeply exhausted. I had just worked a brutal 50-hour week at the hospital auditing a massive insurance discrepancy case, but I had still woken up at 6 in the morning to bake that homemade cherry pie from scratch. I did it just because Barbara had casually mentioned a month ago that it was her absolute favorite dessert. I was always overcompensating, always trying to earn my permanent seat at their table through acts of service. Right as we were passing the serving dish of mashed potatoes, Jessica cleared her throat. She had a highly dramatic way of demanding everyone's absolute attention, a trait her mother had always praised and rewarded. Jessica puffed out her chest and proudly announced that she had finally found the perfect venue for her upcoming wedding. She wanted to book the Oakwood Country Club. It was the most expensive, exclusive, and ridiculously overpriced venue in our entire county. Barbara immediately clapped her hands together, actual tears of joy welling up in her eyes as she praised her daughter's exquisite taste. Thomas patted his sister on the back, proudly, telling her that she deserved nothing but the absolute best for her big day. Then Jessica stopped smiling at her mother and looked directly at me. Her expression grew tight, resembling the calculated look a predator gives right before it strikes its prey. She stated that the non-refundable deposit was due by Tuesday morning. She needed $15,000 immediately. And then, without an ounce of hesitation or shame, she looked at Thomas and me and asked us to sponsor it. She did not ask for a loan. She specifically used the word sponsor, a gift. She casually explained that since Thomas was doing so incredibly well with his landscaping company, and since I was always so boring and good at saving my paychecks, handing over $15,000 was the absolute least we could do for our family. The entire dining room went completely dead silent. I slowly put my heavy silver fork down on my plate. My hands immediately started to tremble under the table, hidden safely out of sight by the thick linen tablecloth. $15,000. Just 6 months prior to this exact dinner, I had completely drained my retirement accounts and permanently cashed out my late mother's small life insurance policy to save Thomas from absolute financial ruin. He had come to me sobbing, claiming a bad business deal had left him $82,000 in debt, and that the bank was threatening to seize Barbara's house because he had secretly used it as collateral. I had given him every single penny I had to my name to save his business and his mother's home. I literally had nothing left to give. I turned my head and looked at Thomas, fully expecting him to step in. I expected my husband to gently explain to his younger sister that we simply did not have that kind of liquid cash available. Instead, Thomas just sat there and stared at me in silence, waiting. He wanted me to be the one to reject her. He wanted me to be the bad guy. I took a very deep breath, fighting to keep my voice as calm, measured, and respectful as possible. I looked at Jessica and told her that Oakwood was a truly beautiful venue, but we simply could not afford to gift her $15,000. I softly explained that we had our own severe financial recovery to focus on right now. Jessica's fake polite smile vanished instantly. She slammed both of her hands down on the table so hard the crystal glasses rattled. Her face turned a furious shade of bright red. She loudly accused me of trying to ruin the most important day of her life out of sheer spite. She started crying, producing real heavy tears, shouting that I had always been incredibly jealous of her happiness, because my own life was so miserable. Barbara immediately rushed around the table to comfort her weeping daughter. Barbara shot me a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. She coldly stated that real family is supposed to sacrifice for each other without questioning it. She proclaimed that money is just meaningless paper, but a sister's wedding is a sacred, once-in-a-lifetime memory that I was heartlessly destroying. I sat there in my chair, absolutely stunned by the sheer staggering magnitude of their entitlement. I looked at my husband again, my chosen partner, my supposed protector, the man whose massive debts I had just paid off with my own childhood trauma money. Thomas slowly stood up from his heavy wooden chair. He picked up his crystal water glass and slammed it down onto the mahogany table with terrifying force. The water violently sloshed over the rim and soaked a dark stain into Barbara's precious linen cloth. The loud, sharp crack of glass against wood echoed terribly in the quiet dining room. He did not look at his mother. He did not look at his dramatically crying sister. He looked directly at me, his eyes overflowing with pure, unfiltered contempt. He pointed his finger aggressively right at my face and called me a selfish, miserable woman. He shouted that I was a cold, calculating accountant who cared more about hoarding bank balances than fostering human connection. And then he crossed a line I truly never thought he would be cruel enough to cross. Thomas leaned heavily across the table, closing the distance between us. His voice dropped low, dripping with absolute venom. He looked me dead in the eyes and called me an ungrateful, broken orphan who did not know the first thing about real family loyalty. He stated that his mother had graciously opened her beautiful home to me, given me a permanent place at her table, and treated me exactly like her own flesh and blood. He claimed I was throwing all of their profound kindness back in their faces over a few measly $1,000. Every single word he spoke felt like a brutal physical blow to my chest. He was intentionally using my deepest childhood trauma, my greatest and most painful vulnerability, as a weapon to completely humiliate me in front of his mother and sister. Then, he delivered his final ultimatum. He stood up straight and pointed his arm directly toward the front door. He told me I had exactly two choices. Either I apologize to Jessica and his mother right this very second and promise to write that $15,000 check, or I pack my bags and walk out of his family forever. The silence that followed his decree was completely suffocating. Barbara sat back down in her chair, a smug, deeply triumphant look settling on her face. Jessica stopped crying, instantly wiping her eyes and waiting for me to break. They were eagerly waiting for me to grovel, to surrender the money, and to beg for forgiveness, just to keep my husband from abandoning me. They fully expected me to fold. That had always been the unspoken dynamic of our relationship. I was the damaged outsider, the lonely orphan desperate for love, the pathetic woman who would endure absolutely anything to avoid being thrown away again. But in that exact crystal clear second, looking at the man, I had sacrificed my entire financial future for the desperation simply vanished. The overwhelming fear of being alone evaporated into the humid air of the dining room. It was rapidly replaced by a sharp, icy, and undeniable clarity. The ruthless financial auditor inside me finally woke up. I looked at the three of them sitting there in their misguided arrogance. I did not shed a single tear. I slowly stood up from my chair. I carefully and quietly pushed it back under the mahogany table. I reached down and picked up my purse from the floor. I looked Thomas dead in the eyes and told him I would absolutely never apologize for refusing to be their personal bank. I turned my back on all three of them and walked straight out the front door into the pouring rain. I did not look back. I did not hear anyone run after me. As I sat in my car and started the engine, my hands were shaking violently, but not from sadness. I was shaking with an intense, burning anger. Thomas thought he had won this battle. He thought he could easily discard me. He had absolutely no idea what kind of storm he had just unleashed. The rain lashed down against my windshield in heavy gray sheets as I drove away from that pristine suburban neighborhood. My tires hissed over the slick asphalt, but the only sound I could truly hear was the echoing ring of my husband's voice ordering me out of his family. My knuckles were bone white where I gripped the steering wheel. I was shivering, but it had absolutely nothing to do with the damp chill inside my car. It was the physical shock of profound betrayal radiating through my chest. I had spent my entire adult life trying to build a safe foundation, yet I was speeding back toward a house that suddenly felt like a hollow shell. When I finally turned my key in the lock and pushed the front door open, the silence of our home was completely deafening. I did not turn on the hallway lights. I just stood there in the dark foyer with rainwater dripping from my coat onto the hardwood floor. I looked into our living room where the shadows stretched across the expensive leather sofa we had picked out together. Looking at that exact piece of furniture, a terrible wave of nausea washed over me. Because that sofa was the exact spot where Thomas had staged the greatest performance of his entire life just 6 months earlier. I closed my eyes and the memory played back with sickening clarity. It had been a Tuesday evening in late September. Thomas had stumbled through that very same front door looking completely destroyed. His usually perfectly styled hair was a mess. His face was pale and drawn, his tie pulled loose. Before I could even ask him how his day at the landscaping company had gone, he collapsed onto the leather sofa and buried his face in his hands. He started sobbing. These were not quiet sniffles, but loud, heaving, desperate sobs that physically shook his broad shoulders. He told me he was ruined. He claimed that his primary business partner had completely vanished, taking all the operating capital and leaving Thomas holding the bag for massive unpaid vendor invoices. I had rushed to his side, wrapping my arms around him, completely terrified by the sight of my usually confident husband falling apart. I asked him how much we needed to fix it. He could barely look me in the eye when he choked out the number. $82,000. The sheer size of that figure had taken the breath right out of my lungs. But the worst part, the part that truly broke my heart and forced my hand, came next. He fell to his knees on the rug right in front of me. He confessed that in a desperate bid to keep the company afloat during the previous winter, he had secretly forged documents to use his mother Barbara's house as collateral for a high-interest bridge loan. He wept as he explained that if he defaulted on this $82,000 debt, the aggressive private lenders would initiate foreclosure proceedings. His mother, the woman who hosted those picture-perfect Sunday dinners, the woman who took pride in her spotless home and her manicured lawn, would be thrown out onto the street. He told me he would rather die than see his mother homeless because of his own reckless mistakes. He begged me to help him. He begged me to save his family. Thomas knew exactly what he was doing when he framed the crisis around his mother losing her home. He knew my deepest, most agonizing psychological trigger. I was a foster child who had bounced from one unstable environment to another after losing my parents. The concept of a secure, permanent home was sacred to me. The thought of Barbara, a woman I was desperately trying to view as a surrogate mother, being violently evicted from her sanctuary, was absolutely intolerable. My husband had weaponized my childhood trauma with surgical precision. I did not even stop to demand the official loan paperwork. I did not ask to see the forged collateral documents. For the first time in my fiercely analytical life, I completely turned off my professional auditor brain and let my wounded inner child take the steering wheel. The very next morning, I drove to the bank. I signed the paperwork to completely liquidate my employee retirement account, accepting the massive early withdrawal penalties without a single complaint. But even that was not enough to cover the $82,000. I had to go into a safety deposit box and retrieve the single, most precious asset I owned. It was a modest life insurance policy my late mother had taken out right before she died. It was the only tangible thing she had left behind to ensure I would have some sort of safety net in this cold world. For over 20 years, I had fiercely guarded that money. I refused to touch it during college when I was eating instant noodles. I refused to touch it when my car broke down and I had to walk to work in the snow. It was my emergency shield. But looking at my weeping husband, I cashed it out. I handed over every single cent of my past and my future to secure his present. I transferred $82,000 into his business account to clear the debt to save the company and to rescue Barbara's home. I did it out of pure, unquestioning love and absolute familial loyalty. I saved his honor. I protected his mother from the devastating humiliation of foreclosure. I gave them everything I had. And yet today, just 6 months after I handed over my entire life savings, Thomas had the absolute audacity to stand in his mother's dining room and call me a selfish, broken orphan. He had the nerve to demand I apologize and threaten to throw me out into the street because I refused to fund his sister's luxurious $15,000 country club wedding. Standing in the dark foyer of our silent house, the blinding fog of emotional shock finally began to lift. The deep, heavy sadness that usually follows a bitter argument evaporated, leaving behind a cold, sharp, calculating clarity. I audit medical billing fraud for a living. My entire career is built on finding the tiny hidden threads that unravel massive corporate lies. I look for numbers that do not add up for behaviors that contradict the paper trail. And suddenly, the behavioral math of my husband's outrage today simply did not calculate. If a man nearly lost his mother's house to foreclosure just 6 months ago, he would be financially terrified. He would be pinching every single penny. He would never casually demand that his wife fork over $15,000 for a party. Furthermore, a man who truly felt the crushing guilt of nearly destroying his family would be endlessly grateful to the wife who saved him. He would defend her against his sister's ridiculous demands. He would never humiliate her. He would never aggressively point to the door and tell her to pack her bags. Unless, of course, the $82,000 debt was never actually about a failing business. Unless the terrifying story about his mother's house being used as secret collateral was a complete and total fabrication. My breathing slowed down. My heart stopped racing and settled into a steady, determined rhythm. I walked out of the dark hallway and stepped into the living room. I turned on the bright overhead lights, banishing the shadows that had hidden my husband's brilliant performance. The weeping, desperate man who had fallen to his knees on this rug was a ghost, an illusion designed to bypass my logic and access my bank accounts. The man at the dining table today, the cruel, arrogant bully who demanded my subservience, that was the real Thomas. I had been completely blind, but I was not blind anymore. I walked past the leather sofa and headed straight for the small home office down the hall. I needed to see the numbers. I needed to trace the exact path of the $82,000 I had transferred. I am an auditor, and it was time to finally audit my own marriage. The rain continued to assault the windows of our quiet house, matching the chaotic pounding in my chest. I walked into the home office and sat down in the heavy leather chair behind the desk. The space was completely dark save for the faint amber glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. My phone vibrated against the wooden surface. The sudden buzz made me jump, but I did not immediately reach for it. I just sat there staring at the illuminated screen displaying my husband's name. It was a text message from Thomas. I slowly picked up the device and read his words. He wrote that he was staying at a hotel downtown for the night. He stated he was giving me the space I desperately needed to reflect on my selfish behavior and figure out exactly how I was going to apologize to his family. He ended the message with a strict command, forbidding me from calling him and telling me to spend the night thinking deeply about what I had done. That was his classic move. It was the same manipulative tactic he had used countless times throughout our relationship. Isolation and silence. He expected me to panic. He fully anticipated that I would spend the entire night pacing the floor, crying uncontrollably, and blowing up his phone with desperate apologies begging him to come back home. He genuinely believed that the threat of his absence would be enough to break my spirit and force me into submission. He thought my overwhelming fear of abandonment would overrule my common sense, but Thomas had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The fragile, desperate woman who would have wept over his empty side of the bed had vanished the moment he pointed to the front door and humiliated me in front of his mother. In her place sat a woman who had just realized she had been profoundly played. Instead of crying, a cold, creeping suspicion began to rise in the back of my mind. It was a dark, nagging feeling that had been buried under months of anxiety and blind loyalty finally clawing its way to the surface. I set the phone face down on the desk. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel the urge to call him. My sorrow was rapidly evaporating, entirely consumed by an intense burning need for the truth. Thomas had called me a cold, calculating accountant as an insult. He intended it to be a sharp jab at my personality, a way to make me feel inadequate and unfeeling compared to his highly dramatic emotional family. But he completely forgot what I actually do for a living. I am not just a paper pusher who balances basic spreadsheets. I am a senior medical billing auditor for a massive healthcare network. My entire professional existence is dedicated to tearing apart incredibly complex financial records. I track down missing decimal points that cost hospitals millions of dollars. I expose sophisticated insurance fraud by finding the tiny, microscopic inconsistencies that arrogant people leave behind. I spend 40 hours a week hunting for the truth in oceans of data. And right now, the behavioral data of my own husband was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. I reached out and pressed the power button on our shared desktop computer. The large monitor flickered to life, casting a harsh, bright blue light across my face. The hum of the hard drive felt like a countdown clock. I cracked my knuckles, took a deep breath, and let my professional auditing instincts take complete control of my brain. Thomas considered himself to be an incredibly clever man. He always made a very deliberate show of leaving his phone unlocked on the kitchen counter to prove he had nothing to hide. He regularly cleared the internet browsing history on our shared computer, jokingly claiming that it helped the machine run faster. He honestly thought his basic digital hygiene made him completely bulletproof. But clearing a browser cache is the digital equivalent of sweeping dirt under a rug. It only fools the people who do not know how to lift the rug and look at the floorboards. I opened the command prompt terminal on the computer. My fingers moved across the keyboard with rapid, practiced precision. I did not bother looking through his regular internet browser. I bypassed the standard applications entirely and accessed our home router's administrative dashboard. The router is the central nervous system of any home network. It logs every single piece of traffic that flows through the house, regardless of whether you clear your personal computer history. I navigated to the domain name system request logs, a massive unformatted text file that detailed every single website connection established by any device on our Wi-Fi network over the past 30 days. It was a staggering amount of raw data lines upon lines of chaotic text, but parsing through raw data is exactly what I do best. I applied a basic search filter to isolate the traffic originating specifically from the localized IP address of Thomas's personal laptop and his smartphone. I sat there, in the silent room, the rain still lashing against the glass, and began to read his digital footprint. Most of it was completely mundane. Sports websites, landscaping equipment, suppliers, local news portals, and streaming services. I scrolled through hundreds of entries, my eyes scanning the text with relentless focus. Then something caught my attention. It was a recurring pattern of traffic directed to a secure, encrypted webmail server. The domain did not belong to the standard email provider Thomas used for his landscaping business, nor was it the generic service he used for his personal accounts. It was an entirely separate, isolated, secure email portal. Furthermore, the timestamps on these specific connection requests were highly irregular. He only ever accessed this specific webmail server late at night, long after I had gone to sleep, or during the brief windows of time when I was out of the house running errands. He had a hidden email account. I copied the web address and pasted it into a new private browser window. The login screen loaded stark and minimal, demanding an email address and a password. I typed in the variations of his name and his business, eventually hitting on a username that closely resembled a nickname he used in high school. The password prompt was the next barrier. Thomas was an arrogant man, and arrogant men rarely believe they need complex security. They assume nobody is smart enough to check up on them. I did not need advanced hacking software. I just needed to know my husband. I tried his mother's maiden name. Incorrect. I tried the street address of his childhood home. Incorrect. I stopped and thought about his monumental ego. I typed in the name of the very first landscaping truck he ever bought, followed by the year he started his company. The screen blinked, the authentication wheel spun, and the inbox loaded, my breath caught in my throat. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a heavy, aggressive rhythm against my ribs. The inbox was almost entirely empty. Thomas was meticulous about deleting his communications. There were no sent messages, no saved drafts, and the primary inbox showed absolutely zero unread emails. He clearly used this account as a burner, a secure drop point for specific communications that he wiped clean immediately after reading. But Thomas was not an auditor. He did not understand the automated architecture of modern financial systems. I moved my mouse and clicked on the spam and trash directories. The trash folder had been manually emptied, but he had neglected to check the automated spam filter. My eyes locked onto a single unread email sitting alone in the digital quarantine. It was marked from an automated financial notification system, the kind of system that generates no reply receipts when bulk transactions are processed. The subject line simply read, Automated Transaction Receipt. Notification. I clicked on the email. The message opened, displaying a stark, formal digital receipt. It detailed a massive wire transfer confirmation. My eyes quickly scanned past the generic bank disclaimers and the privacy warnings. I was looking for the core data points. The date on the receipt was from late September of last year. The exact same week Thomas had fallen to his knees in our living room and begged me to save his mother from foreclosure. I stared at the screen, my vision tunneling until the only thing I could see were the numbers. The receipt confirmed the successful processing of an incoming wire transfer in the exact amount of $82,000. My hands began to shake again, but this time, it was a vibration of pure analytical adrenaline. I needed physical confirmation. I stood up from the desk, my chair rolling back and hitting the wall with a loud thud. I dropped to my knees in front of the heavy metal filing cabinet tucked into the corner of the office. I pulled my personal key from my purse, unlocked the bottom drawer, and frantically flipped through the hanging manila folders. I bypassed the joint tax returns and the household utility bills. I grabbed the thick folder labeled with my personal banking records. I pulled out the specific bank statement from 6 months ago, the one documenting the darkest, most agonizing financial week of my life. I laid the crisp paper flat on the wooden desk right next to the glowing computer monitor. I traced my finger down the printed lines of my own statement until I found the massive, devastating withdrawal. $82,000. Next to the amount was the long alphanumeric Federal Reserve wire transfer tracking code. This code is the unique digital fingerprint assigned to every major financial movement in the banking system. It is how institutions guarantee that large sums of money reach their exact intended destination. I leaned closer to the monitor. I looked at the tracking number displayed on the hidden automated receipt in Thomas's secret email account. Then I looked down at the tracking number printed on my official bank statement. I read the sequence of letters and numbers out loud to the empty room. They matched. Every single digit, every single letter matched perfectly. The $82,000 that I had bled my retirement dry, for the money I had sacrificed from my late mother's life insurance policy, the funds I was explicitly told were going directly to a private lending institution to stop a brutal foreclosure on Barbara's house, had not gone to a bank at all. I traced the transaction routing numbers displayed on the screen. The money had been funneled directly through a primary clearinghouse and deposited into a completely different kind of financial vehicle. I sat back in the leather chair, staring at the undeniable concrete proof glowing in the darkness of the office. The entire crisis, the tears, the desperate pleas, the threat of his mother becoming homeless. It was all a meticulously crafted lie designed to extract my life savings. And I now held the exact digital thread that would unravel his entire existence. The glowing numbers on the computer screen seemed to burn themselves directly into my retinas. The alphanumeric tracking code from my personal bank statement perfectly matched the deposit receipt hidden inside Thomas's secret email account. But the immediate shock of that matching sequence quickly gave way to a much deeper, far more disturbing realization. I leaned closer to the monitor and scrutinized the institutional routing number attached to the incoming wire transfer. As a medical billing auditor, I spend 40 hours a week tracking institutional money flows. I have memorized the routing prefixes for nearly every major commercial bank, private lending group, and aggressive debt collection agency operating in our region. The 9-digit routing number on this receipt did not belong to the predatory private lenders Thomas had tearfully named in our living room 6 months ago. I opened a new browser tab and ran a swift, targeted institutional lookup on the routing digits. The database search took less than 2 seconds to populate the screen, with a result that made absolutely no logical sense in the context of a business debt or a residential foreclosure. The institution listed was Suncrest Title. I sat completely motionless in the heavy leather chair as the crushing weight of that name settled over me. Suncrest Title was a well-known real estate closing firm operating in the upscale neighborhoods on the opposite side of the city. The $82,000 I had bled my mother's life insurance policy to scrape together had not gone to a commercial bank. It had not gone to an angry vendor. It had not gone to stop a foreclosure on my mother-in-law's house. The money had been wired directly into a real estate escrow account. Escrow accounts are specialized financial holding tanks. You do not ever use an escrow account at a title company to pay off a delinquent business loan. You use a title company when you are purchasing property. Thomas had taken my entire life savings, the absolute last shred of financial security I possessed in this world, and used it as a massive, untraceable cash down payment for real estate. My hands gripped the edge of the wooden desk so tightly my fingers ached. If my husband was secretly purchasing property through Suncrest Title, the automated deposit receipt in his burner email would only be the very tip of the iceberg. Real estate transactions require a mountain of documentation. There had to be purchase agreements, property disclosures, wire transfer authorizations, and closing statements. The burner email inbox was far too empty to contain a complete real estate closing packet. He had to be hiding the heavy multi-page digital files somewhere else. I thought carefully about his daily digital habits. Thomas ran a high-end landscaping company. He was constantly dealing with massive architectural blueprints, property surveys, and high-resolution landscape designs. He relied heavily on a premium commercial cloud storage provider to manage his business files. I navigated the browser to his preferred cloud service platform and hit the login page. Getting into this system was going to be significantly harder than guessing the password to a neglected email account. The commercial cloud portal required 2-factor authentication. Even if I guessed his primary password, the system would immediately beam a secure access code directly to his personal smartphone, which he had taken with him to the hotel. For a brief second, a wave of frustrating defeat washed over me. But then I remembered just how incredibly arrogant Thomas truly was. He genuinely believed that his manipulative dominance over me was absolute. He was so intensely confident in my submissive, trusting nature that he had left a vital piece of hardware sitting right in the office. I turned my head and looked at the small charging station tucked into the corner of the room. His secondary work tablet was sitting there plugged into the wall, quietly humming with power. I unhooked the tablet and tapped the screen. It was not locked with a passcode. He only used it for client presentations, and never bothered to secure it. I typed his landscaping truck password into the desktop cloud portal. Instantly, the work tablet in my hand vibrated with a push notification containing the 6-digit secure access code. I typed the numbers into the desktop screen and pressed enter. The security gate vanished, granting me total access to the central nervous system of his entire business and personal life. I found myself staring at dozens of neatly organized digital folders. I scrolled past directories labeled with wealthy client addresses, seasonal inventory spreadsheets, and vendor contracts. I kept scrolling down, completely ignoring the legitimate business files. I was hunting for the anomaly. Deep down, at the very bottom of the directory, nested inside a seemingly innocent archive folder labeled Tax Documents, 2019 was a hidden subfolder. It was vaguely titled Personal Admin. I clicked it open. My breath caught painfully in my throat. Displayed on the screen were the exact documents he had flashed in my face while sobbing uncontrollably on our living room rug 6 months ago. There were the terrifying bank notices demanding immediate payment of $82,000. There were the formal aggressive letters threatening to seize Barbara's house by the end of the month. When Thomas had first presented these papers to me, my vision had been entirely blurred by tears of panic and overwhelming anxiety. I had only seen the bold red letters, the massive balances due, and the sheer terror of my husband losing his family home. I had not looked at them critically. But tonight, viewing them through the cold, sharp lens of a senior financial auditor, the flaws were so glaringly obvious they almost felt insulting. I opened the file properties to view the internal metadata of the digital documents. The timestamps told a devastating story. The creation dates on these supposed bank letters were completely wrong. According to the metadata, these formal notices of delinquency had not been generated months in advance by a financial institution. They had been freshly generated on Thomas's own computer just 3 days before his dramatic weeping breakdown in our living room. I opened the first foreclosure threat letter and zoomed in on the bank logo positioned at the top of the page. It was highly pixelated and blurry around the edges, clearly a low-resolution image copied and pasted from a standard internet search. I scrolled down to the body of the text. The font used for the $82,000 balance due was subtly different from the font used in the rest of the threatening paragraph. The text kerning the specific spacing between the individual letters was entirely inconsistent. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the document in an advanced image editing program. The file literally contained separate visual layers. Thomas had taken a standard generic promotional letter from a local credit union. He had digitally erased the original marketing text and painstakingly typed in his own fraudulent nightmare scenario over the blank space. He had manually inserted the fake loan numbers, the fake foreclosure warnings, and the fake deadlines. He had literally photoshopped his own mother's financial ruin. Barbara's house had never been on the line. The ruthless private lenders threatening to throw his family out onto the street did not exist. The business partner who supposedly vanished into thin air with all the operating capital was a complete and total fiction. Every single aspect of that terrifying crisis had been manufactured on this very computer. I sat back in the heavy leather chair. The cool glow of the monitor illuminated the profound, staggering depth of his betrayal. The sheer, calculated malice of his performance threatened to completely suffocate me. Thomas had deliberately weaponized my deepest, most painful psychological trauma. He knew perfectly well that as an orphaned foster child, the mere concept of a mother losing her sanctuary would bypass all of my logical defenses. He had purposefully orchestrated an elaborate theatrical tragedy. He had fallen to his knees and wept real tears all just to rob me blind. The $82,000 had been a highly targeted, emotionally abusive heist. And earlier today, just hours ago, this same man had the absolute nerve to stand in his mother's dining room and demand that I apologize to his family. He had pointed to the door and threatened to throw me out into the rain because I refused to hand over another $15,000 for his sister's country club wedding. He genuinely thought I was just a naive, desperate, broken woman who would always fold to his aggressive demands. He firmly believed he had successfully drained me of my ultimate safety net and could now toss me aside like garbage or keep me forever trapped under his boot as a convenient source of future income. My chest felt like it was being violently squeezed in a mechanical vice. An intense ache radiated through my body for the terrified girl who had cashed out her dead mother's insurance policy to save a man who secretly despised her. I had given away the only protective shield I had in this world to a man who was actively conspiring against me. But that agonizing, breathless pain did not last long. Within moments, the sorrow rapidly hardened into something entirely different. The grief crystallized into a fierce, consuming fire of resentment that burned hot and bright within my chest. I was not going to cry anymore. I was not going to cower in this dark office and wonder why I was never enough for the people I loved. I was an auditor. I dismantle lies for a living. I was going to follow the money flowing into Suncrest Title. I was going to find out exactly what kind of property my husband had purchased with my life savings. I was going to uncover every single layer of his deceit, and then I was going to burn his elaborate, pathetic lie straight to the ground. The cold, harsh light of a Tuesday morning filtered through the blinds of my home office, bringing with it a profound sense of clarity. I had not slept. I had not moved from the heavy wooden desk where the digital remnants of my husband's massive deception lay, scattered across the monitor. As the clock struck 8, I picked up my cell phone. My fingers did not tremble. I dialed the direct extension of my department supervisor at the hospital. When her voicemail picked up, I left a brief, professionally detached message stating, "I had a sudden family emergency and needed to take a few personal days." My voice sounded completely foreign to me. It was stripped of all the frantic anxiety that had chained me to Thomas for 3 years. I hung up the phone and turned my full attention back to the screen, knowing that my $82,000 had been wired into an escrow account at Suncrest Title was only the first piece of the puzzle. An escrow transfer merely confirms the conduit of the transaction, not the final destination of the funds. I needed to know exactly what piece of real estate my husband had purchased with the money my dead mother had left me to ensure my survival. Fortunately, the American real estate market leaves a permanent, highly detailed public paper trail if you know exactly which municipal databases to exploit. As a medical billing auditor, navigating convoluted institutional databases was my specialty. I opened a secure browsing session and navigated straight to the county tax assessor public portal. For the average citizen, these government websites are notoriously clunky and incredibly frustrating to search. But to me, the interface was a familiar battleground. I set my primary search parameters to filter for all residential property transfers finalized during the exact final week of September. That was the precise window of time when my life savings had been wired into the Suncrest Title holding account. The initial query returned hundreds of recent sales across the metropolitan area. I needed to narrow the field. I refined the search criteria, isolating only the transactions where Suncrest Title was listed as the primary recording agent. The overwhelming list immediately shrank down to a manageable 42 properties. I exported this raw data into a fresh spreadsheet and began filtering the columns by purchase price and mortgage structures. I was hunting for a very specific financial anomaly. I needed a transaction that involved a massive cash down payment roughly matching the amount Thomas had stolen from me. I scrolled past the large commercial acquisitions and the modest suburban starter homes. My eyes scanned the rows of data with relentless focus. Then I locked onto a single line of information that made the breath catch painfully in my throat. It was a luxury condominium unit located in a highly exclusive, newly developed high-rise complex on the far north side of the city. The recorded closing date matched the escrow wire transfer perfectly. I immediately pulled up the public deed of trust associated with that specific property tax identification number. I knew Thomas would never be careless enough to put his own name on a public property record while legally married to me. He was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. As expected, the primary owner on the deed was not listed as Thomas. Instead, the property was registered to a newly formed limited liability company. However, when I cross-referenced the mailing address for the registered agent of that corporate entity, the undeniable truth slapped me right in the face. The registration documents listed the exact same downtown post office box that Thomas used for his high-end landscaping business. He had deliberately used a shell company to hide the purchase. He had taken my profound childhood trauma, manipulated my desperate need for family security, and drained my entire life savings just to secretly buy a luxury apartment. I printed the property deed and the tax records. I folded the warm papers carefully and placed them inside my purse alongside the forged foreclosure letters and the digital wire receipt. I walked into the master bathroom, washed my face with freezing cold water, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I looked pale and deeply exhausted, but my eyes held a sharp, terrifying clarity. I changed out of my wrinkled clothes from the day before, putting on a plain black sweater and dark jeans. I dressed like a shadow. I wanted to be completely invisible. I grabbed my car keys and walked out into the brisk morning air. The drive across the city took exactly 45 minutes. Every single mile that rolled past my windshield felt like a physical transition between two entirely different realities. I drove away from our quiet, modest suburban neighborhood, where I clipped grocery coupons and wore thrift store coats just so Thomas could afford custom-tailored suits for his client meetings. I merged onto the highway and headed toward the wealthy, affluent Northern District, a place defined by towering glass buildings, pristine private parks, and absolute luxury. As I navigated through the winding, tree-lined streets of the upscale neighborhood, a sickening wave of contrast washed over me. This was a completely different world. This was where the city's elite hid their expensive secrets. I finally pulled onto a wide, impeccably manicured avenue and spotted the building. It was a stunning piece of modern architecture, featuring sweeping glass balconies and a private gated courtyard. I slowly drove past the main entrance, keeping my head down. I circled the block until I found a discreet, unassigned visitor parking space, tucked away under the heavy shade of a large oak tree. From this specific vantage point, I had a completely unobstructed view of both the grand lobby doors and the exit ramp of the resident parking garage. I turned off my engine. The sudden silence inside my car was deafening. I rolled my window down just a fraction of an inch to let the crisp morning air circulate, and I began to wait. Stakeouts are not like they appear in dramatic television shows. They are incredibly tedious, physically uncomfortable, and deeply agonizing. You sit in a confined space, completely trapped, with nothing but your own dark, spiraling thoughts. I stared at the towering glass building, visualizing the $82,000 woven into its steel framework. I thought about the days I had worked through my lunch breaks, the vacations I had permanently canceled, and the intense anxiety I had suffered, all to ensure my husband felt supported. I had practically starved my own soul to feed his ambition. For the first 20 minutes, a tiny, pathetic shred of denial tried to fight its way to the surface of my mind. The desperate, wounded orphan inside me whispered that maybe there was a massive misunderstanding. Maybe this was a legitimate business investment he had kept secret to surprise me later. Maybe I was jumping to toxic conclusions and ruining my own marriage. That pathetic shred of denial was permanently vaporized exactly 10 minutes later. A familiar low rumble echoed from the shadows of the resident parking garage. My eyes darted toward the concrete exit ramp. A sleek, customized black SUV slowly rolled up to the security gate. The morning sunlight hit the glossy paint, illuminating the distinct silver trim and the expensive aftermarket rims. I stopped breathing. It was Thomas's vehicle. It was the exact same luxury SUV he claimed he had to buy to project success to his wealthy landscaping clients. He paused at the card reader, but he did not pull out onto the street. Instead, he reversed the heavy vehicle and parked it in a designated loading zone directly in front of the building's lavish glass lobby. He turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. He was wearing a casual, perfectly fitted cashmere sweater and dark designer jeans. He did not look like a man who was currently sleeping in a cheap hotel room because his marriage was falling apart. He did not look like a man burdened by the weight of a devastating family argument. He looked incredibly relaxed. He looked wealthy. He looked profoundly happy. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel with terrifying force. The pain radiating through my chest was so intense it felt entirely physical, like a jagged piece of glass twisting between my ribs. I watched my husband pull his phone from his pocket, tap a quick message, and casually lean against the hood of his expensive car, waiting. 5 agonizing minutes passed. I could hear my own pulse thudding heavily in my ears. Then the heavy glass doors of the lobby glided open. A woman walked out into the morning sunlight. She was stunning. She had long, perfectly styled blonde hair, flawless makeup, and a casual elegance that spoke of expensive Pilates classes and infinite free time. She was wearing a high-end athletic outfit that probably cost more than my entire professional wardrobe. She was the absolute antithesis of me. She was everything I was not allowed to be. But it was not her beauty that made the jagged glass in my chest shatter. It was the way Thomas looked at her. As she approached the cars, my husband's face lit up with a genuine, adoring smile. It was a smile I had not seen directed at me in years. He reached out and smoothly wrapped his arm around her slender waist, pulling her close in a gesture of deep, established intimacy. There was no hesitation. There was no awkwardness. This was not a new, thrilling infatuation. This was the comfortable, confident body language of a couple who had been living together for a very long time. I sat frozen in my car, unable to look away, as the ultimate truth of my existence played out 50 yards in front of my windshield. This was Rachel. This was the woman my life savings had purchased a home for. Then Rachel shifted her stance. As she turned slightly to unlock the passenger side door of the SUV, I saw what she had been carrying resting comfortably on her opposite hip. It was a child. It was a beautiful, chubby-cheeked toddler wearing a bright yellow jacket. The child could not have been more than a year old. The air in my car instantly turned to a solid block of ice. I could not inhale. I could not exhale. The universe completely stopped spinning. I watched through the smudged glass of my windshield as Thomas leaned forward, his face softening with absolute, unfiltered joy. He kissed the blonde woman softly on the lips. Then he leaned down and pressed a long, tender kiss to the top of the toddler's head. He gently tickled the child's cheek, making the little one burst into a fit of delighted giggles that I could clearly hear echoing across the quiet, wealthy street. The timeline slammed into my brain with the devastating force of a freight train. The child was a year old. The pregnancy would have lasted 9 months before that. This meant Thomas had been carrying on an intense, completely parallel life with this woman for at least 2 years. He had been sleeping in my bed, eating the food I cooked, and letting me manage his messy accounting books, while actively building an entire family with someone else across town. The grand weeping performance in our living room 6 months ago suddenly made perfect, horrific sense. The fake foreclosure documents, the phantom private lenders, the manufactured threat of his mother becoming homeless. It had absolutely nothing to do with saving a failing business. He had needed a massive lump sum of cash to secretly buy this luxury condominium for his hidden family, and he had decided that I was going to be the one to fund it. He had literally stolen $82,000 from his orphaned, traumatized wife to buy a lavish nest for his mistress and his secret child. I watched as Thomas carefully secured the toddler into a high-end car seat in the back of his SUV. I watched Rachel slide into the passenger seat with a carefree smile. I watched my husband walk around to the driver's side, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire empire of lies was currently being observed from the shadows of an oak tree, as his black SUV pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the pristine avenue. The agonizing pain in my chest simply vanished. The sorrow, the heartbreak, the desperate longing for a family that had kept me submissive for 3 years evaporated into the cold morning air. What replaced it was a sensation of absolute profound zero. My tears stopped completely. My hands uncurled from the steering wheel and rested calmly in my lap. I did not feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a judge who had just reviewed a guilty verdict. Thomas had effectively stolen my past, hijacked my present, and attempted to bankrupt my future. He had used my deepest vulnerabilities to fund a life he felt he deserved. I reached into my purse and let my fingertips graze the edge of the printed property deed. The emotional girl who would have collapsed and begged for an explanation was completely dead. The auditor had fully taken over. I put my car in gear and pulled smoothly away from the curb, driving away from the luxury high-rise with a terrifying sense of calm. I was not going back to my house to cry. I was going to systematically dismantle his entire existence. I kept my car parked under the heavy shade of the oak tree until Thomas pulled his sleek black SUV away from the luxury high-rise. My hands were perfectly steady on the steering wheel as I shifted into drive and followed him. I made sure to keep at least 2 cars between us as we navigated the busy morning traffic of the affluent northern district. We drove for about 10 minutes until he turned onto a bustling commercial avenue, lined with high-end boutiques and expensive bakeries. He parallel parked his vehicle down the block from a trendy corner bistro. I drove past them, found a discreet parking spot on a side street, and quickly walked back toward the main avenue on foot. I pulled the collar of my dark sweater high around my neck and slipped on a pair of large sunglasses. I wanted to be absolutely invisible. Thomas and Rachel had settled at a small wrought iron table on the outdoor patio of the bistro. The seating area was separated from a public pedestrian walkway by a dense manicured boxwood hedge. It was the perfect visual barrier. I walked around to the public side of the thick green foliage and found a small concrete bench directly behind their table. I sat down facing away from them, appearing to be just another city resident, enjoying the crisp morning air. In reality, I was sitting less than 3 feet away from my husband and his secret family. I could actually smell the familiar cedar and citrus scent of the expensive cologne I had bought him for our 2nd anniversary. I reached into my purse, pulled out my smartphone, and opened the voice recording application. I pressed the red button, locked the screen, and placed the phone carefully on the bench right next to the dense leaves. For the first few minutes, their conversation was completely mundane. They talked about ordering lattes and sharing a butter croissant. They cooed at the toddler whom Rachel called Leo, praising him for eating his fruit. Listening to my husband use that sweet, high-pitched parental voice with a child I never knew existed made my stomach churn violently. But I forced myself to sit completely still. I was an auditor gathering raw data, and I needed to capture every single word. The casual morning chatter did not last long. Rachel let out a heavy, frustrated sigh that carried clearly through the branches of the hedge. She complained that she was completely exhausted from living like a ghost. Her voice was sharp, tinged with genuine resentment, as she told Thomas how much she hated looking over her shoulder every time they went out in public together. She whined that her friends were constantly asking when they were going to get officially married, and she was running out of excuses to give them. She demanded to know when she could finally walk into his landscaping company office as his actual partner, instead of pretending to be a random client. She told him she was incredibly tired of hiding their son from the world just because he was still legally tied to a woman he did not even love. I held my breath, waiting for my husband's response. When Thomas finally spoke, the sound of his voice made the blood freeze in my veins. It was not the arrogant, aggressive tone he had used to humiliate me at the Sunday dinner table. It was a soft, incredibly gentle, and profoundly manipulative cadence. It was the exact same soothing voice he used to comfort me when I woke up crying from nightmares about my childhood in the foster care system. He was a perfect emotional chameleon, seamlessly adapting his personality to extract exactly what he needed from the specific woman sitting across from him. Thomas reached across the bistro table. I could hear the soft clinking of his expensive watch against the metal patio furniture as he presumably took her hand. He softly urged her to be patient for just a little while longer. He proudly promised her that the finish line was finally in sight, and he had set the absolute final phase of his master plan into motion just yesterday afternoon. Rachel asked him what he meant. Thomas let out a low, deeply arrogant chuckle. He began to recount the events of the Sunday dinner with terrifying glee. He proudly explained to his mistress that he had deliberately orchestrated the entire explosive argument over his sister's country club wedding. He told Rachel he knew perfectly well that demanding a $15,000 cash gift was completely outrageous, especially since he knew my bank accounts were totally drained. He intentionally pushed me into a corner where my only logical option was to refuse. He did it solely to make me look like a selfish, unsupportive monster in front of his mother and sister. Rachel asked if his family knew about his real plan to leave me. Thomas laughed again, a harsh, dismissive sound. He told her that Barbara and Jessica were completely clueless about her and the baby, but they were incredibly useful pawns in his game. He called his own mother a deeply dramatic woman who loved playing the victim, and he called his sister a greedy brat who only cared about her wedding aesthetic. He explained that by making me the villain who ruined Jessica's big day, he had successfully turned his entire family against me. My heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs as I listened to the man I married lay out his strategy for my destruction. Thomas boasted that his mother and sister were now perfectly primed to testify against me in any future divorce proceedings. He said they were fully prepared to stand up in court and paint me as a hostile, emotionally unstable, and deeply disrespectful wife who verbally abused his family and disrupted their peaceful home. But court testimony was only a backup plan. His primary goal was far more insidious. He told Rachel his ultimate objective was to completely break my spirit. He wanted to isolate me, shut me out, and make me feel so entirely abandoned that my childhood trauma would completely overwhelm my logical brain. He planned to make me feel so much crushing, desperate guilt that I would gladly sign any legal document he put in front of me just to earn his forgiveness. He specifically named a post-nuptial agreement. He explained that he was going to have his lawyer draft a document where I voluntarily relinquished all of my marital rights to his landscaping company and its commercial assets. He said I was so desperately terrified of losing my only family that I would sign away my entire financial future just to stop him from being angry with me. And the moment my signature was on that paper, he was going to file the divorce papers, evict me from our home, and finally move Rachel and Leo into the open. I sat on the concrete bench staring blankly at a crack in the sidewalk. The sheer sociopathic scale of his cruelty was almost too massive to comprehend. He was not just leaving me. He was actively trying to annihilate me. He wanted me to walk away completely destitute, carrying the full blame for the collapse of our marriage, while he seamlessly transitioned to his new life with my money paving the way. Then Rachel brought up the most vital piece of the puzzle. She expressed anxiety about the massive mortgage payments on their luxury condominium. She worried that a messy, protracted divorce might freeze his business accounts and leave them unable to afford their lavish lifestyle. She nervously asked what would happen if I hired a forensic accountant and demanded half the equity in the high-rise apartment. Thomas scoffed loudly. He confidently told her to completely stop worrying about the condominium finances. He proudly reminded his mistress that they had already put down a massive 50% cash payment on the property on the very day they closed with Suncrest Title, effectively cutting their monthly mortgage obligations in half. Rachel asked how he had managed to pull such a massive sum of liquid cash out of his company without raising any red flags on their joint tax returns. Thomas did not hesitate. He leaned back in his bistro chair and completely dismantled the greatest sacrifice of my entire life. He cheerfully explained his masterful weeping performance in our living room 6 months ago. He bragged about downloading a low-resolution bank logo from Google Images, typing up phony foreclosure threats, and throwing himself onto our rug in a state of manufactured panic. He proudly recounted how easy it was to trigger my profound fear of homelessness. He told Rachel that Barbara's house was never in any danger of foreclosure. He had never used his mother's property as collateral for a private bridge loan. The vicious creditors did not exist. The missing business partner was a total fabrication. He laughed as he described how I had rushed to the bank the very next morning to drain my retirement accounts and cash out my dead mother's life insurance policy. He literally referred to me as his blind, easily manipulated mobile bank. He called me a walking, breathing, automated teller machine with severe abandonment issues. He told his mistress that his family was merely a highly convenient emotional cover to completely bypass my analytical brain. He knew that if he asked for an $82,000 business investment, I would have demanded to see profit and loss statements, balance sheets, and vendor contracts. But by framing the crisis around saving his mother from being thrown out onto the street, he knew I would hand over the cash without asking a single administrative question. I was nothing but an easy funding source, a deeply damaged woman he could effortlessly exploit to secure a lavish, debt-free life for his secret family. I reached down and slowly pressed the stop button on my voice recording application. I saved the audio file to multiple secure cloud servers instantly. The last remaining fragment of my broken heart completely withered and died right there on that concrete bench. There was no more sorrow. There was no more confusion. There was only the cold, mechanical hum of a professional auditor who had just gathered the definitive evidence to close the largest fraud case of her entire career. Thomas thought he had orchestrated the perfect crime. He truly believed he had outsmarted a woman whose entire professional existence was dedicated to holding deceitful people financially accountable. He assumed my childhood trauma made me permanently weak, fundamentally desperate, and incredibly easy to discard. He forgot that surviving the foster care system does not make you weak. It makes you a survivor. It teaches you how to endure absolute devastation and keep walking forward. I stood up from the bench, my legs perfectly steady. I did not look back at the bistro patio. I did not need to see their faces again. I walked calmly back to my car, got into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I pulled the printed property deed, the fake foreclosure letters, and the Suncrest title tax records from my purse. I placed them neatly on the passenger seat right next to the phone that now contained his full, unprompted audio confession. My husband had treated me like a mobile bank to fund his secret life, and he intended to use his mother and sister as human shields to finalize his grand exit. He wanted to force me out of his life with nothing but the clothes on my back and a mountain of misplaced guilt. But Thomas had made a fatal error. A bank does not just give you $82,000 for free. A bank always demands repayment with incredibly high interest, and a bank will absolutely ruin your entire life to collect what it is owed. I started my car and merged into the morning traffic, completely ready to begin the ruthless, systematic destruction of his entire world. It would have been incredibly easy to walk right onto that sun-drenched bistro patio and flip their wrought iron table onto the concrete. I could have marched straight up to Thomas, slapped him across his perfectly relaxed face, and screamed the truth at the top of my lungs. I could have caused a massive public scene, shattered his morning coffee date, and confronted his beautiful mistress, while the entire neighborhood watched us fall apart. Every emotional, deeply wounded fiber of my being screamed at me to get out of my car and destroy his happiness right then and there. The betrayed wife inside me wanted immediate, explosive vengeance, but the senior financial auditor inside me knew that loud public confrontations were the absolute worst way to win a war. If I lost my temper and screamed at him in front of Rachel, I would automatically hand Thomas the ultimate gift. I would give him the opportunity to control the narrative. He was a master manipulator, a man who could cry on command and twist reality to fit his needs. If I attacked him in public, he would immediately play the victim. He would look at Rachel, shake his head with a sad, long, suffering smile, and tell her that I was exactly as emotionally unstable and hostile as he had claimed. He would use my perfectly justified anger to completely validate his carefully constructed lies. Furthermore, tipping my hand too early would give him the crucial time he needed to drain his business accounts, move his hidden assets, and protect his luxury real estate. So I did not open my car door. I did not shed a single tear. I sat quietly in the shadows of the large oak tree, breathing in slow, measured counts, until my heart stopped hammering against my ribs. I waited until his sleek black SUV completely disappeared into the morning traffic. Then I put my own car in drive and headed back toward the suburbs. The agonizing sorrow of losing my marriage had been entirely replaced by a cold, calculating sense of purpose. When I returned to our quiet suburban house, the space no longer felt like a home. It felt like a compromised crime scene. I walked straight into the master bedroom and grabbed a heavy canvas duffel bag from the back of the closet. I did not pack clothes or sentimental trinkets. I packed survival gear. I gathered my passport, my birth certificate, and my social security card. I opened the small fireproof safe hidden under the floorboards and removed the original faded paperwork for my late mother's life insurance policy, the exact policy I had cashed out to save a man who secretly despised me. I collected every single piece of physical documentation that tied my identity to his. I moved back to the home office and spent 2 grueling hours backing up all of the digital evidence I had discovered. I downloaded the forged foreclosure letters, preserving the damning metadata that proved Thomas had created them on his own computer. I secured the escrow transfer receipts from Suncrest Title, the property deed for the luxury condominium, and the corporate registry forms for his shell company. Most importantly, I made 3 separate digital copies of the audio recording from the bistro patio. I loaded everything onto a secure encrypted solid-state drive and slipped it into the bottom of my duffel bag. I knew exactly what I had to do next, and I knew I could not do it alone. I needed a legal mercenary. I did not want a gentle mediation-focused family law practitioner who believed in amicable separations and equitable compromises. I did not want to sit in a warmly lit office and talk about my feelings. I needed a litigator who treated divorce court like corporate warfare. I needed an attorney who specialized in tearing apart fraudulent financial empires. During my time auditing massive hospital billing networks, I had occasionally crossed paths with some of the most aggressive legal minds in the city. There was one name that instantly came to mind: David Kensington. He was a senior partner at a prestigious downtown firm widely feared for his absolutely ruthless approach to high-asset divorces and marital financial crimes. He had a reputation for leaving deceitful spouses entirely bankrupt. I found his direct office number, dialed it, and calmly informed his intake secretary that I had uncovered a massive, multi-layered case of financial fraud involving a forged $82,000 extortion. Within 10 minutes, David Kensington agreed to see me for an emergency afternoon consultation. His office was located on the 35th floor of a towering steel and glass building offering a sweeping, dominant view of the city skyline. The interior was decorated in dark mahogany and brushed steel designed specifically to intimidate. When I walked into his private suite, David was sitting behind a massive desk. He was a sharply dressed man in his late 50s with piercing gray eyes that looked right through social pleasantries and straight into the bottom line. He gestured for me to sit down clearly, expecting to deal with a weeping, emotionally shattered housewife who needed a tissue box and a gentle pep talk. He was severely mistaken. I did not cry. I did not waste a single second complaining about a broken heart or a ruined future. I sat down, unzipped my bag, and placed my encrypted drive and a thick stack of printed evidence directly onto the center of his spotless desk. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered a perfectly concise, chronologically ordered executive summary of my husband's deception. I watched David Kensington's expression rapidly shift from polite, practiced patience to predatory fascination. I started by showing him the fake foreclosure documents. I walked him through the digital metadata proving exactly how and when Thomas had used image editing software to doctor a generic bank letter. I explained how he had weaponized my childhood trauma regarding homelessness to completely bypass my logical defenses. Then I slid my personal bank statements across the mahogany wood, highlighting the $82,000 withdrawal and the corresponding federal wire transfer tracking code. I did not stop there. I presented the automated receipt I had recovered from the hidden email server, proving the funds had been routed directly to Suncrest Title. I handed him the public tax records and the property deed for the luxury high-rise condominium, mapping out the precise connection between the real estate shell company and Thomas's landscaping business. Finally, I pulled out my phone and played the audio recording I had captured from the bistro patio. The heavy silence in the pristine law office was absolutely absolute, as my husband's arrogant voice filled the room. David Kensington sat perfectly still, listening as Thomas proudly bragged to his mistress about orchestrating the explosive argument over his sister's country club wedding. We listened as Thomas cheerfully confessed to faking the financial crisis to rob his traumatized wife blind, using his own mother and sister as convenient human shields to force a divorce. When the recording finally ended, the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system was the only sound left. David leaned back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers together. A slow, deeply dangerous smile spread across his face. He looked at me with an expression of profound professional respect. He told me that in 30 years of practicing high-stakes litigation, he rarely encountered a client who handed him a fully loaded, perfectly aimed weapon. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk, and began to outline the sheer legal devastation we were about to inflict upon my husband. David explained that we were dealing with two entirely separate, incredibly severe legal violations. First, we had the issue of the $82,000. Because that money came directly from my personal retirement accounts and the life insurance policy established by my mother long before I even met Thomas, it was legally classified as my premarital separate property. By deliberately fabricating a crisis, forging official banking documents, and emotionally extorting those specific funds from me under entirely false pretenses, Thomas had crossed a massive legal threshold. This was not a simple marital disagreement over spending habits. This was textbook fraud by inducement. David explained that using a forged document to compel a wire transfer of that magnitude constituted a severe financial crime. Thomas had effectively stolen money from a separate estate to enrich himself. But the legal leverage grew even stronger when we factored in where the stolen money had actually gone. David detailed the concept of dissipation of marital assets. In a standard divorce, spouses are required to divide their resources fairly. However, when one spouse secretly funnels marital or separate funds toward a hidden romantic partner, the entire legal framework shifts aggressively against them. Thomas had essentially drained my resources to provide a lavish lifestyle, a luxury roof, and a massive down payment for Rachel and their secret child. David's gray eyes gleamed with absolute certainty as he laid out the counterattack. We were not going to ask for a polite settlement. We were not going to negotiate through mediators. We were going to completely sever Thomas's access to the financial world. First, David's team would file an ex parte emergency injunction with the family court judge first thing Monday morning. Because we possessed undeniable concrete proof that Thomas had already stolen separate property and was actively conspiring to force a fraudulent post-nuptial agreement, the judge would immediately grant our request. This injunction would instantly freeze every single business and personal bank account tied to Thomas and his landscaping company. He would not be able to withdraw a single dollar. He would not be able to pay his employees, service his equipment, or access any operating capital. His thriving business would be entirely paralyzed overnight. Second, and far more devastatingly, David explained the concept of a constructive trust and a lease pendens. Because Thomas had used my stolen $82,000 to secure the 50% down payment on the luxury condominium, I now held a massive, undeniable, equitable claim to that specific property. David was going to file a formal legal notice of pending litigation directly against the deed of the high-rise apartment. This meant Rachel and Thomas would instantly be trapped. They would be completely legally prohibited from selling, refinancing, or borrowing against their luxurious nest. The property would be severely encumbered, effectively chained to our impending lawsuit. Furthermore, David assured me that we would demand the court force an immediate liquidation of the asset to return my stolen funds, with interest effectively threatening to rip the roof right over Rachel's head. I sat in the mahogany office, carefully absorbing the magnificent, terrifying power of the legal strategy being laid out before me. Just 24 hours ago, I had been standing in my mother-in-law's dining room, desperately fighting back tears, as my husband demanded I apologize for refusing to hand over $15,000. He had pointed to the front door and threatened to cast me out into the world with nothing. He thought he held all the power. He thought he was untouchable. He had absolutely no idea that while he was sitting in his expensive customized SUV, kissing his beautiful blonde mistress, and playing house with his secret child, I was quietly securing the exact legal mechanisms required to annihilate his entire reality. He was going to lose his company. He was going to lose his luxury condominium. And when the brutal financial reality of his decisions finally crashed down upon him, he was going to lose Rachel too. David Kensington slid a thick stack of retainer agreements and legal authorizations across the desk. He handed me an expensive silver pen. He asked me if I was absolutely certain I wanted to proceed with this level of total financial warfare. He warned me that once we filed the emergency motions and dropped the hammer, there would be no turning back. It would be incredibly ugly, deeply public, and totally destructive. I did not hesitate for a single second. I thought about the sheer exhaustion in my bones, the years of wearing thrift store clothes, and the agonizing panic of emptying my dead mother's insurance policy to save a man who viewed me as nothing more than a convenient breathing bank vault. I thought about his mother and sister, who had eagerly cheered for my humiliation. I took the silver pen and signed my name on the solid black lines with perfect, unwavering precision. I handed the documents back to David. I told him I did not just want to win the divorce. I wanted to make sure my husband never forgot what happens when you try to bankrupt an auditor. The weapon was fully loaded, and I was entirely prepared to pull the trigger. Walking out of the towering glass skyscraper that housed my attorney's office, the crisp afternoon air felt remarkably different against my skin. I was no longer a terrified victim wandering in a dense fog of confusion and profound hurt. I was now the chief architect of my own justice, securely holding the lethal blueprints to my husband's complete financial destruction. However, successfully executing those intricate blueprints required a massive amount of patience and a highly calculated performance. My attorney had been brutally honest about the rigid judicial timeline. The legal system, even when dealing with emergency injunctions and blatant documented fraud, moved at its own deliberate, methodical pace. He explained that navigating the complex corporate veil of the shell company Thomas had used to purchase the luxury apartment required precision. My legal team needed at least 72 hours to properly draft the voluminous motions, secure a private hearing with the family court judge, and officially register the pending litigation against the hidden condominium. This meant I had a critical, incredibly dangerous gap of time to cover. It was currently Monday afternoon. I had to keep Thomas completely relaxed entirely, unsuspicious and blissfully unaware of the impending legal avalanche until Friday morning, which was the earliest window the judge could officially sign the orders to freeze his bank accounts. If my husband caught even a microscopic whiff of defiance, if his paranoid mind sensed that I had stopped begging and started fighting, he would immediately rush to liquidate his business assets. He would empty the commercial accounts, drain the remaining funds, and warn his beautiful blonde mistress to hide. I could absolutely not allow that to happen. To secure my ultimate victory and protect my stolen life savings, I had to willingly walk right back into the lion's den. I had to swallow my pride, bury my burning rage deep down inside my chest, and deliver the absolute greatest acting performance of my entire life. I had to resurrect the exact persona Thomas thought he had successfully broken just yesterday. I climbed into my sedan, locked the doors, and allowed the quiet interior of my vehicle to become my private rehearsal space. I closed my eyes tightly and forcefully recalled the agonizing, suffocating panic I used to feel whenever Thomas threatened to leave me. I channeled the deep, hollow ache of my isolated childhood, the terrifying instability of bouncing through the foster care system, and the sheer, desperate hunger I once felt to belong to his picture-perfect family. I let those old, buried fears bubble up into my throat until my chest physically tightened and my breathing became authentically ragged. I pushed myself, pinching the bridge of my nose until genuine tears began to sting the corners of my eyes and roll down my cheeks. When I was sufficiently hyperventilating, sounding like a woman entirely broken by her own isolation, I picked up my phone and dialed the downtown hotel where Thomas had smugly told me he was staying. He answered on the fourth ring, letting out a heavy, exaggerated sigh designed to explicitly communicate how deeply annoyed he was by my very existence. He did not say hello. He did not ask if I was okay. He just coldly demanded to know why I was violating his strict instructions not to contact him while he was seeking space from my toxic behavior. I let out a loud, shuddering sob that echoed perfectly in the small cabin of my car. I pressed the phone tightly to my ear and began to weep into the receiver. I begged him not to hang up the phone. I forced my voice to crack and tremble pathetically as I told him I had spent the entire night agonizing over my terrible, selfish decisions. I cried that the empty house was completely suffocating me, that the terrifying thought of losing him and losing his wonderful mother and sister was tearing my soul apart. I played the role of the submissive, dependent wife to absolute, flawless perfection. I told him I was so incredibly sorry for being stingy and cruel about the money for Jessica's country club wedding. I whimpered that I was just a stupid, fearful person who did not understand the true sacred meaning of family loyalty because I had never had a real family of my own. I handed him every single psychological weapon he had ever used against me, wrapping it up in a bow of pure submission. The silence on the other end of the line was thick and heavy with his monumental arrogance. I could practically hear his massive ego swelling, filling the quiet digital space between us. He let me cry for a full, agonizing minute, intentionally, forcing me to steep in my own fabricated humiliation, while he enjoyed his total dominance. When he finally spoke, his tone was completely devoid of warmth, empathy, or forgiveness. He sounded like a disappointed king addressing a disobedient, worthless peasant. He told me that my tears were meaningless water. He stated that I had deeply insulted his mother, a woman who had graciously opened her pristine home to a damaged orphan and treated me like her own flesh and blood. He sneered that a simple, weeping phone call was an incredibly pathetic way to try and fix the immense, unforgivable damage I had caused to his sister's special milestone. I choked back another heavily manufactured sob and begged him to tell me exactly how I could make it right. I pleaded with him to give me just one more chance to prove that I could be a good, obedient, and supportive wife. I told him I would do absolutely anything he wanted. That was the exact phrase he was waiting to hear. Thomas let out a low, arrogant hum of satisfaction. He told me that if I truly wanted to save our marriage and avoid being thrown back out into the cold world alone, I was going to have to prove my absolute submission in front of the very people I had so deeply offended. He then issued his grand, humiliating ultimatum. I was going to host a formal dinner party at our house this coming Friday night. He demanded I cook a massive, elaborate feast entirely from scratch, specifically requesting a complicated roasted tenderloin that would keep me chained to the kitchen for hours. He rattled off the mandatory guest list with cruel, calculating precision. I was to invite his mother Barbara, his sister Jessica, and his judgmental aunt and uncle. I was going to serve them their favorite expensive wines, clear their plates, and wait on them hand and foot like a hired servant. But the domestic servitude was only the beginning of his elaborate punishment. Thomas coldly commanded that once dinner was fully served, I would stand up at the head of the mahogany table in front of his entire gathered family and officially apologize. He specifically stated that I would look his mother directly in the eye and beg for her forgiveness for my disrespect. I would look at Jessica, humble myself, and promise to write a check for $15,000 the very next morning to sponsor her country club venue. He wanted me to completely humiliate myself to publicly strip away my own dignity so his family could sit back, drink their wine, and relish their absolute victory over the outsider. And then he casually dropped the final lethal piece of his trap into the conversation. He mentioned in an almost bored tone that his family attorney was drafting a small, simple post-nuptial agreement regarding our household finances. He framed it as a necessary trust-building exercise to ensure I never tried to selfishly hoard or control his hard-earned money again. He said he would bring the document to the dinner party, and I would sign it in front of everyone to legally prove my absolute loyalty to the family structure. I knew exactly what that innocent-sounding document really was. I knew from the damning audio recording I had captured at the sunny bistro patio that the agreement would legally strip me of all my marital rights to his landscaping company and its massive commercial assets. It was the crucial legal document he desperately needed me to sign, right before he served me with divorce papers, kicked me out of the house, and finally moved his beautiful blonde mistress into the open. I clutched the steering wheel, fighting down a violent wave of pure, unadulterated disgust. I made my voice sound incredibly small, completely broken, and entirely defeated. I whispered into the phone that I completely understood his demands. I promised I would make Friday night absolutely perfect. I swore I would apologize properly, grovel before his mother, and sign whatever legal paperwork he needed me to sign to keep our precious family together. Thomas grunted his gruff approval sternly, warned me not to mess up this final opportunity, and abruptly hung up the phone without saying goodbye. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. The fake, trembling tears instantly stopped falling from my eyes. My ragged, panicked breathing smoothed out into a slow, calm, and incredibly steady rhythm. A cold, terrifying smile stretched across my face in the silence of my parked car. Thomas honestly thought he had successfully cornered a frightened, helpless mouse. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed a senior financial auditor the exact venue, the perfect captive audience, and the precise ticking timeline she needed to completely execute his public annihilation. The next 4 days were an absolute masterclass in psychological warfare and domestic camouflage. I went to the upscale grocery store and purchased the most expensive cuts of beef, the finest imported wines, and massive bouquets of fresh flowers. I perfectly mimicked the frantic, eager behavior of a desperate housewife trying to buy back her angry husband's fleeting affection. I scrubbed and cleaned our suburban house until every single hardwood surface and granite countertop gleamed. I polished the good silver and carefully ironed the expensive linen tablecloths, setting a dining table that looked fit for a king. But behind the scenes of this exhausting domestic performance, the heavy steel blade of the legal guillotine was being quietly hoisted high into the air. On Thursday afternoon, while the house smelled intensely of roasted garlic and red wine reduction sauce, a discreet legal courier arrived at my front porch. He carried a heavy, securely sealed manila envelope directly from my attorney's downtown law firm. I took the package into my home office, locked the solid wooden door behind me, and tore it open. Inside were the final official affidavits required to secure the emergency financial injunctions. The legal team had successfully drafted the incredibly complex, irrefutable motions detailing the $82,000 fraud, the forged foreclosure documents, the hidden escrow transfer, and the massive illegal dissipation of marital assets regarding the luxury condominium. The family court judge was officially scheduled to review the undeniable evidence and sign the emergency asset freeze orders first thing on Friday morning. I just needed to sign the final sworn statements verifying the absolute authenticity of the financial evidence I had painstakingly gathered. I stood in my pristine kitchen on Thursday evening, a delicate floral apron securely tied around my waist. I wiped a stray, genuine tear of raw onions from my eye as I prepared the elaborate meal Thomas had demanded for his grand return. I walked over to the marble kitchen island, where the thick stack of lethal legal documents lay spread out right next to my wooden cutting board. I picked up a heavy black ink pen. While the expensive dinner simmered on the stove preparing to feed the arrogant people who actively conspired to destroy my entire life, I smoothly and confidently signed my name to the very papers that would permanently freeze my husband's business accounts, severely encumber his hidden luxury real estate, and completely obliterate his carefully constructed future. The trap was now officially and legally set. Thomas wanted a Friday night spectacle. He wanted to sit back and watch me kneel and beg for mercy in front of his cruel mother and entitled sister. He was definitely going to get his grand, unforgettable dinner party. But the person who would be begging for mercy by the end of the night was absolutely not going to be me. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times, its deep, resonant tones echoing through a house that felt less like a home and more like a carefully constructed stage set. It was Friday evening, the night of my mandated surrender. The weather outside was typical for a brisk autumn night in the suburbs, with dry leaves scraping against the front porch. But the climate inside my mind was absolute glacial zero. I had spent the entire day executing the domestic duties of a desperate, pleading wife. The air was thick with the rich, savory aroma of roasted beef, tenderloin, caramelized shallots, and a heavy red wine reduction sauce. Every crystal goblet on the long mahogany dining table had been polished until it gleamed under the warm amber glow of the chandelier. The heavy silver flatware lay perfectly aligned on crisp white linen tablecloths. I moved through the kitchen and the dining room with the mechanical fluid precision of a ghost. There was absolutely no anxiety left in my veins. The terrified, submissive woman who had wept into the telephone just days prior had been thoroughly and permanently eradicated. In her place stood a woman armed with the absolute terrifying certainty of impending justice. As a medical billing auditor, I was trained to look at the whole picture to find the hidden truths beneath layers of deception. Tonight, I was auditing my own life. I checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. I wore a simple, dark navy dress. My hair pulled back neatly, completely devoid of jewelry. I looked exactly like the humble, defeated spouse Thomas expected to see. Precisely at 7 o'clock, the heavy brass knocker on the front door slammed twice. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, took one final, centering breath, and walked down the corridor to welcome my executioners. When I pulled the heavy oak door open, the sheer, unadulterated arrogance radiating from the porch hit me like a physical blow. Barbara stood on the welcome mat wrapped in a tailored camel hair coat, her chin tilted upward at an angle that practically demanded I avert my eyes. Beside her stood Jessica, aggressively chewing a piece of mint gum while furiously texting on her smartphone. Her eyes darted past me, already scanning the foyer as if mentally cataloging the inventory of a house she fully expected her brother to win in the impending divorce. And then there was Thomas. He had arrived a few minutes earlier, parking his expensive, customized SUV in the driveway before orchestrating this grand unified entrance with his mother and sister. He stepped over the threshold and immediately took his designated position in the living room, casually leaning his shoulder against the stone fireplace. He crossed his arms over his broad chest, projecting the manufactured aura of a deeply generous, long-suffering patriarch who was patiently waiting for an errant, troubled child to submit to his authority. Barbara did not offer a polite greeting. She did not ask how I was doing. She simply stepped past me, her expensive leather boots clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. She held out her coat without making a single second of eye contact, treating me with the exact same dismissive energy one might reserve for an incompetent hotel coat check attendant. She coldly instructed me to put her coat on a proper wooden hanger so the shoulders would not be ruined. Jessica followed right behind her, breezing past me, without a word, dropping her designer handbag onto the entryway console table. I took their coats and hung them in the closet. My hands did not tremble. My breathing did not hitch. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I was observing subjects in a behavioral study. They were so entirely intoxicated by their perceived victory, so thoroughly blinded by their own narcissism, that they could not sense the massive, invisible steel jaws resting wide open right beneath their feet. They marched into my dining room like conquering generals, claiming a surrendered territory. I guided them to the table. The atmosphere was incredibly heavy, saturated with a suffocating, oppressive silence. This was not the comfortable, familiar quiet of a family gathering to share a meal and unwind after a long week. It was the tense, highly anticipated silence of a hostile audience, waiting for the curtain to rise on a public execution. I moved around the heavy mahogany table, seamlessly performing the duties of the obedient servant Thomas required for his ego. I served the meticulously prepared tenderloin, carefully arranging the slices. I ladled the roasted seasonal vegetables onto their fine bone china plates. I poured the expensive, full-bodied Cabernet Sauvignon into their crystal glasses, ensuring I filled Thomas's glass slightly higher than the rest. I did all of this with a placid, appropriately apologetic smile plastered across my face. Barbara took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. She set the delicate glass down and immediately made a passive-aggressive comment about the texture of the meat, projecting her voice just loud enough for the entire table to hear. She sighed and noted that while the effort was appreciated, true culinary refinement was inherited, not simply learned from a cookbook. Jessica snickered softly, swirling the dark ruby liquid in her glass before taking a large gulp. She did not even bother to look at me. Thomas simply watched me from the head of the table. His dark eyes were calculating, filled with a sickening mixture of absolute triumph and blatant disdain. He was relishing every single miserable second of my supposed humiliation. He honestly believed that this elaborate domestic performance I was putting on was a desperate, panicked attempt to secure my place in his wealthy world. He had no idea that I was simply keeping them occupied, keeping them fed and complacent, while the family court judge downtown officially stamped the final seal on the emergency asset freeze orders. The meal dragged on for what felt like an eternity. I ate absolutely nothing. I simply sat at the opposite end of the long table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, flawlessly playing the role of the broken, defeated wife. I listened to Jessica complain endlessly about her country club wedding venue, whining that the floral arrangements were going to cost an additional $5,000. I listened to Barbara brag about her upcoming social club events and the new luxury sedan she planned to lease. I listened to Thomas boast about securing a massive new commercial landscaping contract for a downtown corporate plaza. They talked right through me. They completely ignored my presence, intentionally rendering me a ghost in my own dining room. It was the exact same toxic, degrading dynamic that had slowly suffocated me for 3 long years. But tonight, their cruelty held absolutely no power over me. Every condescending remark, every cruel smirk, every dismissive gesture they threw in my direction only solidified the magnificent, ruinous justice of what I was about to do. I watched Thomas pour himself a second glass of wine. His posture relaxed entirely, unaware that the $82,000 he had stolen from me was currently securing a condominium for his mistress that was about to be legally seized. Finally, as the last plates were pushed aside and the wine bottles sat nearly empty, the defining moment arrived. The air in the dining room seemed to instantly thicken, the ambient temperature dropping 10 degrees. Thomas leaned back heavily in his chair and reached for his crystal goblet. He picked up a solid silver dessert spoon and tapped it sharply against the side of the glass. The sharp, ringing chime cut through the quiet room like a blade demanding absolute, unwavering attention. Barbara immediately stopped talking and folded her hands neatly on the table, her posture rigid, her eyes locking onto me with predatory anticipation. Jessica put her smartphone face down on the linen cloth, a cruel, expectant, mocking smile spreading across her painted lips. Thomas cleared his throat, adjusting his posture to loom over the table. He delivered a slow, incredibly condescending speech that he had clearly practiced in his head. He spoke grandly about the fundamental importance of family loyalty, respect, and hierarchy. He lectured me on the sacred duties of a supportive wife and the severe, unavoidable consequences of selfish, disrespectful behavior. He looked down the length of the mahogany table, staring directly into my eyes with a chilling lack of empathy. He stated that they had allowed me to host them tonight because I claimed I was ready to take accountability for my hostile actions. He reminded me that I had insulted his mother and attempted to ruin his sister's wedding with my selfish financial hoarding. He declared that the time had come for me to make things right. He ordered me to stand up. He demanded that I officially apologize to his mother for my insolence and that I humbly ask his sister for forgiveness regarding her wedding funds. He commanded me to prove that I was truly committed to fixing the monumental damage I had caused. He coldly demanded that I finally show them I understood my place in this family. The silence that followed his command was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. You could have heard a single pin drop on the hardwood floor. I did not shrink away. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool, conditioned air fill my lungs. I did not cry. I did not tremble. I pushed my chair back, the wood scraping loudly against the floorboards, and slowly stood up to my full height. I looked at Barbara's expectant, haughty face, waiting for me to grovel. I looked at Jessica's greedy, waiting smirk, anticipating a massive cash check. I looked at my husband, the man who had played upon my deepest traumas, treated me like an automated teller machine, and actively plotted my total financial ruin with another woman. I did not offer them a single word of apology. Instead, I calmly turned away from their staring eyes and stepped over to the dark wooden sideboard resting against the dining room wall. I opened the heavy top drawer and reached inside. I bypassed the extra silver and the linen napkins. I pulled out the thick, heavy manila envelope that my attorney's legal courier had delivered just 24 hours ago. I turned back to face the table, holding the massive stack of irrefutable, completely devastating financial documents securely in my hands. The silence in the dining room was absolute and suffocating. You could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I stood at the head of the heavy mahogany table with the thick manila envelope gripped firmly in my hands. The air was thick with the rich scent of roasted beef tenderloin and caramelized shallots, but the atmosphere felt entirely toxic. Every eye in the room was locked onto me. Thomas leaned comfortably against the back of his chair with his arms crossed over his chest. A smug and arrogant smile played on his lips. He was waiting for me to break. He fully expected me to burst into tears, drop to my knees, and deliver the pathetic, groveling apology he had demanded. He thought I was just seconds away from signing away my entire financial future, just to keep his precious family intact. Barbara sat rigidly in her seat, her posture perfect, her chin tilted upward in an expression of sheer disdain. She was holding a crystal wine glass, waiting to accept my complete surrender. Jessica slouched next to her, tapping her manicured fingers against the expensive linen tablecloth, a cruel smirk etched across her face. They all looked like victors waiting to collect their spoils. They honestly believed they had broken my spirit, but I did not cry. My eyes were completely dry. The frightened, desperate woman they had bullied and manipulated for the past 3 years was gone. I looked straight at Thomas, meeting his arrogant gaze with a terrifying, absolute calm. The smug smile on his face faltered for a fraction of a second as he registered the profound shift in my demeanor. I did not look like a woman preparing to beg for mercy. I looked like an executioner. "Yes, I owe everyone an explanation," I said. My voice was incredibly steady, echoing clearly across the long dining room. The sound of my own voice surprised even me. It carried no fear, no hesitation, and absolutely no submission. I slowly lowered my gaze from my husband and turned my full attention to my mother-in-law. But first, I want Barbara to see this. I opened the flap of the heavy manila envelope. The thick stack of documents felt like a loaded weapon in my hands. I bypassed the legal injunctions and the asset freeze orders for a moment. I reached directly for the official bank statement I had printed earlier that week. It was the complete, undeniable record of my personal finances. The paper was crisp and white, stamped with a bright red seal of authentication from my financial institution. I pulled it out and tossed it down in the very middle of the dinner table. The paper glided across the polished mahogany surface and came to a stop right next to Barbara's fine bone china dinner plate. The sudden, sharp sound of the paper hitting the table shattered the heavy silence in the room. A look of utter bewilderment washed over Barbara's face. Her perfectly manicured eyebrows pulled together in a deep frown. She slowly set down her crystal wine glass, entirely confused by my sudden defiance. This was not part of the script Thomas had promised them. She was supposed to receive an apology, not paperwork. She reached out with cautious, hesitant fingers and picked up the bank statement. She pulled her reading glasses from the chain around her neck and perched them on her nose. "Last April, Thomas told me that his mother was about to lose the house because he had lost a massive amount of money in his business," I said loudly and clearly, ensuring every single syllable resonated through the room. I watched Barbara's eyes scan the top of the document. I watched the initial confusion begin to curdle into something far more complicated. He fell to his knees right there in the living room. I continued, pointing a finger toward the stone fireplace where Thomas had delivered his fraudulent performance. He wept, actual tears. He told me ruthless private lenders were going to throw you out onto the street. He pressured me, he manipulated my deepest childhood traumas, and he begged me to use my dead mother's $82,000 inheritance to save this house. Barbara's head snapped up. Her mouth opened in shock. She looked at me, then turned her bewildered gaze toward Thomas. The color began to drain rapidly from her cheeks. The arrogant superiority that had defined her posture all evening completely dissolved into sheer, unadulterated panic. Thomas shot forward in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The smugness was entirely gone from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, suffocating horror. He opened his mouth to shout to interrupt me to regain control of his collapsing narrative, but I did not let him speak. I raised my voice, infusing it with the cold, commanding authority of a senior financial auditor presenting undeniable evidence of a crime. "But look closely. Mom, the money didn't go into the bank," I commanded. Look at the routing numbers. Look at the federal wire transfer code stamped next to that massive withdrawal. That money did not go to any commercial bank. It did not go to any private lender. The money did not go into the bank to save your home because your home was never actually in danger. Jessica dropped her smartphone onto the table with a loud clatter. Her cruel smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, uncomprehending shock. She stared at her brother, finally realizing that the endless well of money she had counted on for her lavish country club wedding was rapidly evaporating before her eyes. Thomas was visibly trembling now. His chest heaved as he struggled to find air. He tried to push his chair back and stand up, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door, as if calculating the distance for a desperate escape. He was a cornered animal, realizing the trap that had just snapped shut on his own neck. He knew exactly what was coming next, and he knew there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. I reached my hand back into the thick manila envelope. My fingers brushed past the property deeds and the tax assessor records until they found the glossy high-resolution photographs I had printed. I pulled out the entire stack of images. They were vivid, undeniable pictures of the reality my husband had built with my stolen life savings. I threw the series of photos across the long dining table. They scattered over the white linen, sliding past the expensive wine glasses and the silver flatware. There were clear, bright images of Thomas standing in the sunlight. There were pictures of him embracing Rachel, wrapping his arms around her slender waist in front of the sweeping glass balconies of the luxury high-rise condominium. There were close-up shots of the beautiful blonde woman smiling adoringly at my husband. And, most devastatingly of all, there were crystal-clear photographs of Thomas holding their illegitimate child, the beautiful toddler, wearing the bright yellow jacket. The glossy photographs lay face-up on the table, an inescapable mosaic of betrayal and fraud. Barbara stared down at the images, her eyes wide with absolute horror. She saw her son holding a child she had never met. She saw the expensive architecture of a building she had never visited. The polished, aristocratic facade she had maintained for decades crumbled into dust right in front of me. She looked like a woman who had just watched her entire world shatter into a million irreparable pieces. Jessica covered her mouth with her hand, letting out a sharp, genuine gasp of disbelief. I looked directly at Thomas. His face was the color of chalk. His breathing was ragged and shallow. The powerful, commanding man who had demanded my total submission just hours ago was completely gone. He was nothing but a pathetic, exposed fraud standing in the wreckage of his own monumental lies. "That money was used to buy a home for your son's mistress," I said. My voice was a cold, razor-sharp blade slicing through the suffocating tension of the room. "He did not save your house, Barbara. He stole my future to purchase a luxury apartment for the woman he has been sleeping with for years." The absolute silence that followed my words was deafening. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to echo like thunder. The entire dynamic of the room had inverted in a matter of seconds. I was no longer the weak, isolated orphan begging for scraps of affection from a family that despised me. I was the auditor who had just exposed the largest, most devastating financial crime of my life, and I was going to make sure every single person in this room paid the absolute highest price for their cruelty. I stood tall at the head of the table, looking down at the ruined, silent family, feeling nothing but the cold, magnificent rush of absolute justice. The glossy photographs hit the crisp white linen tablecloth with a sharp slapping sound that echoed off the dining room walls. They scattered across the mahogany table like a deck of tarot cards, predicting absolute ruin. I watched the scene unfold in what felt like extreme slow motion. The vivid, high-resolution images of Thomas embracing his blonde mistress in front of the luxury high-rise condominium were impossible to misinterpret. The crystal-clear picture of my husband tenderly kissing the forehead of his secret toddler sat completely exposed right next to the expensive silver flatware. The rich, savory aroma of the roasted beef tenderloin we had not yet touched suddenly seemed sickeningly heavy, hanging in the air alongside the suffocating weight of my revelation. Thomas stared down at the visual evidence of his alternate life. The arrogant, victorious flush that had colored his cheeks all evening vanished in an instant. The polished, controlling patriarch persona he had worn like a tailored suit completely evaporated, replaced by a sickly, ashen gray pallor that made him look like a corpse. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the room was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. No one breathed. No one moved. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was too massive for his family to immediately process. Then the primal instinct for self-preservation finally kicked in. Thomas snapped out of his paralyzed state with a violent, panicked jerk. He forcefully pushed his heavy dining chair backward, the thick wooden legs screeching loudly against the polished floorboards. He lunged across the wide table, his arms frantically sweeping over the crystal wine glasses and the delicate bone china plates. He was desperately trying to snatch the photographs out of plain sight. His sudden erratic movement knocked over a half-empty bottle of expensive Cabernet Sauvignon. The dark red liquid gushed out, spilling across the pristine white linen like a fresh wound soaking into the fabric and dripping down toward the floor. But Thomas did not care. His hands shook uncontrollably as he gathered the glossy pictures, clutching them tightly to his chest as if hiding them would somehow erase the objective truth. He turned his wild, panicked eyes toward his mother and sister. He began to shout. His voice was shrill, completely devoid of its usual smooth, commanding baritone. He yelled that I was a crazy, vindictive woman. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me, screaming that I had lost my mind and manufactured these images to ruin his sterling reputation. He desperately claimed that I was deeply sick, that my childhood trauma had finally made me snap. He insisted that I had hired someone to digitally forge the bank statements and alter the photographs just to get back at him for our petty marital problems. He begged his mother not to listen to a single word I said. He was literally sweating a thick sheen of terrified perspiration gathering on his forehead and rolling down his neck. It was a pathetic, frantic display of a cornered coward, refusing to accept that his meticulously constructed reality had just imploded. I did not raise my voice to shout over his pathetic lies. I did not need to defend myself against his frantic, baseless accusations. I had spent my entire career auditing financial records, uncovering the quiet, undeniable truths buried beneath layers of loud, chaotic deception. I simply reached into the pocket of my dark navy dress and pulled out my smartphone. The screen glowed softly in the dim, warm lighting of the dining room. I unlocked the device with a single, steady swipe of my thumb and opened the voice recording application. I tapped the screen and maximized the volume setting to its highest limit. The chaotic shouting from my husband abruptly died in his throat. The silence in the room deepened, becoming so intensely heavy, it felt physically crushing as everyone watched my deliberate, unhurried movements. Thomas froze completely. His eyes locked onto the small electronic device in my hand, and the last remaining drop of blood completely left his face. He knew exactly what I was holding. He knew I had been the one sitting behind the thick boxwood hedge at the sunny bistro patio. I pressed the red play button and placed the phone gently on the table, right next to the spreading stain of spilled red wine. The crisp, clear sound of the outdoor cafe filled our quiet dining room. First, there was the ambient noise of city traffic, the faint chirping of birds, and the soft clinking of ceramic coffee cups against saucers. And then came his voice. It was undeniably Thomas. The audio quality was absolutely flawless. His smooth, arrogant tone echoed through the room, cutting through the tense atmosphere like a finely sharpened blade. Everyone sitting at the mahogany table heard him complain about his annoying, financially dependent wife. They heard his mistress, Rachel, whining bitterly about having to hide their illegitimate child from the world. They heard her complain about wanting to walk into his landscaping office as his official partner. The contrast between the sweating, desperate man standing in the dining room and the confident, bragging man on the recording was incredibly stark. And then the true devastation began. We all sat in absolute silence and listened as the recorded version of Thomas cheerfully bragged about his brilliant, manipulative scheme. His voice filled the space, proudly boasting about how he had intentionally orchestrated the explosive relationship-ending argument over Jessica's country club wedding venue. I watched his family carefully as the recording continued to play. He explicitly detailed how he had purposefully pushed me into a corner regarding the $15,000 gift just to make me look like a selfish monster. He laughed on the recording, a cruel, deep, mocking sound that made my mother-in-law physically flinch in her chair. We listened as he casually referred to his own family members as clueless, highly useful pawns. He confidently told Rachel that Barbara and Jessica would gladly testify against me in family court because they were too blind to see they were being actively used as human shields. He outlined his entire sociopathic plan to force me into signing a post-nuptial agreement, legally relinquishing all my rights to his company assets before officially throwing me out onto the street with absolutely nothing. The recorded Thomas spoke with such casual, terrifying malice about the very people sitting right here in this room. He treated his own mother and sister not as loved ones, but as incredibly convenient, easily manipulated tools designed solely to facilitate his smooth transition to his new secret family. I shifted my gaze to Barbara. For decades, this woman had prided herself on her impeccable moral standing. She was a recognized pillar of her local community, a woman who attended church every single Sunday morning without fail. She always dressed in her finest tailored clothes, sitting in the very front pew to ensure everyone in the congregation noticed her righteous devotion and respectable status. She constantly judged others for their perceived moral failings, using her inherited wealth and her family name as a heavy bludgeon against anyone she deemed socially inferior. She had looked down on me for years because I came from the foster care system, subtly implying that my lack of a proper pedigree made me inherently flawed and unworthy of her golden boy. But now she was being violently forced to listen to her beloved perfect son confess to a level of calculated depravity that defied all moral comprehension. She was hearing him cheerfully admit that he had stolen an orphaned girl's life savings to buy a luxury apartment for a woman he was sleeping with behind his wedding vows. She was hearing him laugh at her own gullibility. The rigid, aristocratic posture Barbara had maintained for her entire life slowly collapsed under the sheer weight of the audio confession. Her shoulders slumped forward, destroying the pristine lines of her expensive blouse. The meticulously manicured hands resting on the edge of the table began to tremble violently. She looked down at the authenticated bank statement still resting near her plate, the bright red seal mocking her previous ignorance. Her beloved son had not been the tragic victim of a ruthless business partner or predatory commercial lenders. He had been the apex predator all along. He had looked her in the eye, weaponized her love for him, and used their family home as a fake bargaining chip to extort $82,000 from me. The illusion of her flawless, highly respected family was disintegrating right before her eyes, broadcast in high-definition audio for everyone to hear. The recording finally ended with a soft electronic click, leaving behind a deafening, toxic silence. Thomas stood by the overturned wine glass, his chest heaving completely out of excuses. He had no more elaborate lies to spin. He could not claim the recording was fabricated or taken out of context. It was his exact voice detailing his specific financial crimes and his intimate knowledge of our private household dynamics. He looked at his mother, his eyes wide, with a silent, incredibly desperate plea for rescue. He was waiting for her to instinctively protect him, to wrap her arms around him, and to find some twisted way to blame me for driving him to commit such extreme acts of fraud. He wanted her to save him the way she had always saved him from the consequences of his actions. But Barbara did not rush to his defense. She slowly reached out with her trembling, aged hands and picked up the authenticated bank statement one more time. She stared at the numbers printed on the page, the massive withdrawal that represented my entire sense of security, which her son had heartlessly stolen and squandered on a secret mistress. She let the thick paper slip from her fingers. It fluttered down and landed squarely in the puddle of spilled wine soaking up the dark red stain until the numbers blurred together. Barbara slowly lifted her head. She looked at her golden boy, the son she had elevated above all others, with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The maternal warmth in her eyes was completely dead, replaced by a cold, horrified realization of exactly who she had raised. Her voice, usually so haughty and commanding, was barely more than a ragged broken whisper. She uttered 5 deadly words that effectively severed the foundation of their entire family forever. He lied to us all. Those 5 words hung in the dining room heavy and absolute. They were the definitive death knell of Thomas's carefully constructed empire. Jessica sat completely paralyzed in her chair. The cruel, expectant smirk she had worn all evening had been entirely wiped away, leaving behind a blank mask of total shock. She looked physically ill, her skin possessing a faint greenish tint under the chandelier light. The entitled young woman who had gleefully anticipated cashing a $15,000 check from me just moments ago was now grappling with a far more terrifying reality. She was realizing that her older brother, the man who was supposed to be the wealthy financial bedrock of their family, had actively used their good name to siphon off money to support a secret woman and an illegitimate child. She realized that the lavish country club wedding she had been obnoxiously bragging about to all her friends was now thoroughly tainted by massive, humiliating financial fraud. The endless well of money she had counted on was completely dry, drained entirely to furnish a luxury apartment for a blonde woman she had never even met. Jessica opened her mouth to speak to defend herself or perhaps to yell at her brother, but she was completely speechless. Her jaw worked soundlessly. There were absolutely no words left to defend him. There were no more cruel insults to throw at me. The absolute truth had stripped them of all their power, all their unearned arrogance, and all their comfortable illusions. They were sitting in the wreckage of their own toxic dynamic. I stood calmly at the head of the table, looking at the utter devastation I had unleashed upon the people who had tried to destroy me. I had not yelled. I had not begged for their mercy. I had simply done my job. I had audited the facts, gathered the irrefutable evidence, and presented the cold, hard truth. And in doing so, I had watched my husband's entire world burn to the ground. The crushing weight of the revelation settled over the dining room, burying any remaining trace of the arrogant patriarch Thomas had pretended to be just moments before. His mother had just delivered the final fatal blow to his ego, declaring to the room that he had lied to them all. The air in the room was entirely stagnant, heavy with the scent of roasted garlic, and the sour tang of spilled red wine soaking into the linen tablecloth. Thomas stood frozen by his overturned crystal goblet. His mouth opened and closed silently like a fish pulled from the water, desperately searching for a lifeline that no longer existed. He looked frantically at his mother, extending a trembling hand toward her perfectly tailored sleeve, begging for the blind maternal protection that had shielded him from the consequences of his actions for his entire life. Barbara physically recoiled. She pulled her arm back with a sharp, disgusted motion, pressing herself firmly against the high back of her dining chair, as if her own son were a dangerous contagion. It was exactly at that moment, cutting through the suffocating toxic silence of the ruined dinner party, that the front doorbell rang. The sharp, sudden chime echoed down the hallway, making both Jessica and Barbara jump in their seats. Thomas whipped his head toward the entryway, his dark eyes wide with a frantic, hunted paranoia. I did not jump. I simply checked the slim silver watch on my wrist. It was exactly 8:00 in the evening. David Kensington, my fiercely aggressive litigation attorney, had promised me that his premium private process server would arrive precisely on schedule. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the front of my navy dress, and calmly walked out of the dining room to answer the door. I pulled the heavy oak door open to reveal a tall, broadly built man standing on the welcome mat. He wore a nondescript gray suit and held a thick, tightly sealed manila envelope in his right hand. His expression was completely blank, maintaining the absolute professional detachment of a man who delivered life-altering bad news for a living. He looked past me, his eyes scanning the brightly lit foyer until they landed on Thomas, who had cautiously crept out of the dining room to see who was at the door. "Are you Thomas Walker?" The man asked, his voice a low, steady rumble that carried easily into the house. Thomas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He looked at the stranger, then at the thick envelope, and finally at me. He slowly nodded his head, completely unable to form a vocal response. The process server stepped confidently over the threshold. He walked directly up to my husband and pressed the heavy envelope firmly against Thomas's chest, forcing him to reflexively grab it before it fell to the hardwood floor. "You have been officially served," the man stated with clinical precision. He then turned on his heel, walked back out into the cool autumn night, and firmly pulled the front door shut behind him. Thomas stood in the entryway clutching the envelope like it was a live explosive. His hands were shaking so violently that the thick paper audibly rattled in the quiet house. Barbara and Jessica had slowly emerged from the dining room, standing together in the hallway, watching the scene unfold with terrified fascination. Thomas tore the top of the envelope open. He pulled out a massive stack of legal documents bound by a heavy black clip. The cover page was stamped with the official, undeniable seal of the county family court. I watched his panicked eyes dart across the bold, capitalized black text printed across the top margin. Ex parte emergency injunction and order for asset freeze. The remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His legs physically buckled, forcing him to lean his entire body weight against the hallway console table to keep from collapsing onto the floor. He flipped frantically through the pages, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he read the comprehensive, unyielding legal destruction of his entire world. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, until I was standing less than 2 feet away from the man who had tried to systematically destroy my life. I did not yell. I did not scream. I spoke with the icy, calculated precision of an auditor delivering a final, damning financial report. I am not just getting a divorce, I declared, my voice echoing coldly off the foyer's walls. I am suing you for massive financial fraud. Thomas looked up at me, his eyes filled with a terror so profound it almost looked like physical agony. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to negotiate, but I cut him off immediately. I wanted him to understand the absolute inescapable reality of the trap he had confidently walked into. Rachel's luxury apartment has been legally sealed, I told him, enunciating every single word so his family could hear exactly where his loyalties truly lay. My attorney filed a lis pendens against the property deed this afternoon. You and your mistress cannot sell it. You cannot refinance it. You cannot borrow a single dime against it. It is officially locked down, and the court is preparing to place it directly on the foreclosure auction list to satisfy your debts. He let out a pathetic, suffocated whine, shaking his head back and forth as if trying to physically dislodge the words from his brain. But I was not finished. The decimation of his real estate was only the first half of the penalty. Your landscaping company has been entirely frozen by a judge's order, I continued, my gaze boring straight through his panic. You cannot access your commercial operating accounts. You cannot access your personal checking accounts. You cannot withdraw cash. You cannot pay your vendors. And you cannot run your business. Every single financial artery you possess is completely paralyzed until you repay me the principal and the interest of the $82,000 you extorted from my dead mother's estate. Jessica gasped loudly from the hallway, finally comprehending the sheer magnitude of her brother's crimes. He had not just lied about a minor indiscretion. He had committed a massive felony to fund a secret life, and he had used their family name as the ultimate emotional weapon to execute the heist. You thought I was nothing but a blind, desperate, easily manipulated mobile bank? I said, leaning in slightly, watching his eyes widen as he recognized the exact phrases he had used on the bistro patio just days ago. You thought you could use your mother and your sister as convenient human shields to force me into signing away my rights. You honestly believed you could break my spirit, throw me out into the street with nothing, and walk away clean. I took a deliberate step back, surveying the pathetic, sweating creature leaning against the table. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no sorrow. The overwhelming desperation I had once harbored to be a part of his family was completely dead, replaced by the magnificent, empowering rush of claiming my own justice. You demanded that I host this dinner tonight, I said, gesturing toward the dining room where the cold, uneaten tenderloin still sat on the table. You brought your family here specifically to watch me humiliate myself. You wanted to point to the front door and kick me out of my own home. I paused, letting the silence stretch for a long, torturous moment. Well, the door is right there. But you are the one who needs to pack your bags and leave tonight. The reality of his absolute ruin finally crashed down upon him, with the weight of a collapsing building. Thomas let out a loud, agonizing sob. His knees entirely gave out, and he collapsed onto the hardwood floor, landing heavily at my feet. He dropped the massive stack of legal documents. The papers fanned out across the floorboards, displaying the official court stamps and the undeniable evidence of his fraud. He looked up at me from the ground, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated desperation. He was crying genuine tears now, begging me to stop the legal proceedings, pleading with me to remember our marriage, swearing that Rachel meant nothing to him, and that he would leave her immediately if I just unfroze his business accounts. He was groveling, debasing himself in the exact manner he had proudly planned for me. When he realized I was looking at him with nothing but cold, clinical disgust, he desperately turned his tear-stained face toward the hallway. He looked up at his mother and his sister, "Mom, please," he begged, his voice cracking pathetically. "Please tell her she cannot do this. Tell her we are a family. Help me." Barbara looked down at her son kneeling on the floor amidst the scattered evidence of his own sociopathic deceit. For decades, she had enabled his arrogance. She had funded his mistakes, covered up his flaws, and actively participated in his cruel manipulation of anyone she deemed beneath their social class. She had fully supported his attempt to break me. But Barbara was above all else a woman who worshipped her own public reputation. She understood that her son had not just ruined his own life. He had permanently attached the stench of massive financial fraud and a secret illegitimate family to her pristine social standing. He had made a complete fool of her, using her as a disposable prop in a criminal scheme. Barbara did not reach out to help him up. She did not offer a single word of maternal comfort. Her face hardened into a mask of pure self-preserving ice. She turned to her daughter. "Get your purse, Jessica," Barbara commanded, her voice devoid of any emotion. "We are leaving." Jessica did not hesitate. The young woman who had marched into my house expecting a $15,000 wedding donation quickly grabbed her designer handbag from the console table. She actively stepped around her brother, carefully avoiding the scattered legal documents on the floor, as if they were physically contaminated. "Mom, you cannot just leave me here," Thomas cried out, reaching a hand toward the hem of Barbara's expensive camel hair coat. Barbara smoothly stepped backward, pulling her coat out of his reach. She looked at him with an expression of profound, permanent rejection. "You have made your choices, Thomas," she said coldly, "and you have humiliated this family for the very last time. Do not call my house." Without another word, Barbara opened the heavy oak door and walked out into the brisk autumn night. Jessica followed closely behind, pulling the door firmly shut, leaving Thomas entirely alone on the floor with the woman he had tried to destroy. The poetic, absolute justice of the moment resonated deep within my bones. He had spent years isolating me, making me feel like a worthless burden who should be grateful for the scraps of his family's attention. Now, in his darkest, most desperate hour, his own flesh and blood had instantly discarded him to protect themselves. He was finally experiencing the exact terrifying abandonment he had routinely weaponized against me. I looked down at the sobbing, broken man on the floor. I felt incredibly light, as if a massive, suffocating physical weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I did not say another word to him. I simply turned around, walked up the stairs to my bedroom, and locked the door, leaving him to gather his clothes and face the cold, unforgiving reality of the street. The legal battle that followed over the next 6 months was completely ruthless, but it was remarkably brief. Because I had secured absolute, undeniable proof of his fraud and his illegal dissipation of separate property, Thomas had absolutely no leverage to negotiate. His high-priced defense attorneys quickly abandoned him when his business accounts remained frozen, and he could no longer afford their exorbitant retainer fees. Rachel, the beautiful blonde mistress who had grown accustomed to a life of luxury, funded by my stolen money, immediately vanished the moment the bank initiated the foreclosure proceedings on their upscale condominium. She packed her bags, took their child, and moved out of state, completely unwilling to stand by a man who had lost his company and his wealth. My attorney, David Kensington, relentlessly pursued the recovery of my assets. We forced the rapid liquidation of his commercial landscaping equipment and seized the remaining capital from his business accounts. Not only did I recover the original $82,000 he had stolen from my mother's life insurance policy, but the judge also awarded me maximum interest punitive damages and total ownership of our suburban home, which I promptly sold for a massive profit. Thomas walked away from our marriage with absolutely nothing but a mountain of insurmountable debt, a shattered reputation, and a permanently fractured relationship with his own mother and sister. It has been nearly 2 years since the night I handed my husband that manila envelope. I am 30 years old now, and my life looks incredibly different. I left the suburbs and bought a beautiful, bright apartment in a vibrant neighborhood downtown. I received a major promotion at the hospital billing department, transitioning from a senior auditor to the director of compliance. I spend my days ensuring that massive financial systems operate with integrity and transparency. I am no longer the terrified, submissive orphan desperately trying to buy love from a family that viewed me as a disposable appliance. I am a woman who knows exactly how to read the fine print, how to demand what she is owed, and how to ruthlessly protect her own peace, If you are watching this, and you find yourself constantly shrinking to fit into a relationship where you are entirely unappreciated, please listen to me carefully. Do not ever believe that your trauma makes you weak. Do not ever let someone convince you that you have to purchase their loyalty through endless draining sacrifices. True family, whether biological or chosen, does not treat you like a mobile bank. They do not weaponize your fears to control your behavior. You possess an incredible inherent worth that requires absolutely no validation from toxic people. If you discover that the people you love are actively conspiring against you, do not panic, and do not confront them without a plan. Gather your evidence. Secure your resources. Find the absolute best legal and financial support you can possibly afford, and strike back with cold, calculated precision. Boundaries are not simply emotional concepts. They are fortified walls that you must be willing to defend. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love you can ever commit is letting the people who hurt you experience the absolute, unmitigated devastation of their own terrible choices. Thank you so much for staying with me and listening to my story until the very end. If my journey resonated with you, if you have ever had to summon the courage to walk away from a manipulative relationship and rebuild your life from scratch, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring these vital stories to other people who desperately need to hear them. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me where you are watching from today, and let me know the exact moment you finally realized your own worth and decided to stop accepting less than you deserve. Remember, you hold the power to audit your own life, and you have every right to permanently close the accounts of anyone who tries to bankrupt your soul. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next video. The wheels of the legal system turn at their own deliberate pace, but they grind exceedingly fine. Half a year after that fateful Friday evening dinner party, my divorce was officially finalized, and the judge signed the absolute decree. My legal strategy had executed its purpose with surgical perfection. Thomas was utterly ruined. Once the court injunctions froze his commercial operating accounts, his landscaping business suffocated in a matter of weeks. He was completely unable to purchase supplies or pay his laborers. I watched from a safe distance as he was forced to file for total. Chapter 7 Bankruptcy. Watching his entire professional reputation dissolve into the permanent public record. His massive corporate contracts were terminated, and his expensive fleet of branded trucks was repossessed and auctioned off to the highest bidder. The poetic justice extended far beyond his corporate entity. Rachel, the beautiful blonde mistress who had grown entirely accustomed to a lavish lifestyle funded by my stolen inheritance, showed her true character the very second the cash flow stopped. The absolute moment she discovered he was entirely penniless, and that the luxury high-rise apartment had been legally seized, she packed her bags. She abandoned him without a single backward glance, taking their toddler and vanishing into thin air. She was completely unwilling to stand by a man who could no longer supply her with endless luxury and unearned security. Thomas was left holding absolutely nothing. Stripped of his company, his hidden assets, and his monumental pride, he had to endure the ultimate humiliation for such an arrogant man. He was forced to move right back into his mother's house, relegated to living in Barbara's damp and cramped basement. The former golden boy who had once ruled our household with an iron fist was now quietly ostracized by his own family. He became a permanent, exhausting liability, whispered about in hushed tones, as his mother and sister desperately tried to avoid the corporate and social shame he had brought upon their pristine reputation. His grand plans for absolute control ended with him sleeping on a tiny twin bed, surrounded by dusty storage boxes. While Thomas stewed in his manufactured misery, my world opened up with an incredible, brilliant light. I successfully clawed back every single dime of my stolen money. My attorney secured the full $82,000 principal, along with maximum court-ordered interest and hefty punitive damages. I used my meticulous expertise as a financial auditor to completely restructure my life from the ground up. My professional dedication did not go unnoticed at the medical billing department, and I was advanced to a senior executive director of corporate compliance managing a massive regional team. For 3 long years, I had put off my own dreams, canceling vacations and hoarding resources to support an ungrateful husband and an entitled sister-in-law. But now I finally started booking the trips I had delayed for so long because of someone completely unworthy. I flew to the sun-drenched coast of Italy, drinking rich espresso in tiny seaside cafes and walking along the ancient cliffside paths. I spent 2 magical weeks exploring the historic cobblestone streets of Edinburgh, taking deep breaths of the crisp Highland air. I was finally taking up space in the world entirely unburdened and profoundly whole. Looking back at the smoldering wreckage of my marriage, I realized that my survival required a painful but incredibly vital lesson. Love and devotion should never under any circumstances be purchased with total blindness. For 3 long years, I had mistakenly believed that if I just shrank myself a little bit more, if I was just a little more agreeable and a little more generous, I could finally earn a place of respect and belonging in their family. I was completely wrong. Real love is never a transactional debt, and being useful to someone is absolutely not the same thing as being genuinely loved. Kindness without firm boundaries is nothing but a standing invitation for devastating exploitation. If you are listening to my voice right now and someone you love is taking advantage of your kindness, please pay close attention. If they are actively using your desire for a family connection as a toxic weapon of manipulation against you, do not break down and cry. Tears will never stop a narcissist, and begging will never change the heart of a thief. Do exactly what I did. Stay calm. Keep your head completely clear, and silently gather your irrefutable evidence. Document every single transaction record, every suspicious conversation, and let the cold, objective authority of the law speak powerfully on your behalf. You are a person of profound inherent value, and you deserve so much better than the pathetic scraps of conditional affection they toss your way. You have every right to claim your life, lock your doors, and leave the people who hurt you to face the ruinous consequences of their own deception. If this journey has touched your heart today, and if you have ever sacrificed your own financial security, your own happiness, or your own dignity for people who did absolutely nothing but treat you like a burden, I want to hear your voice. Take a strong stand right now and type "Enough is enough" in the comments section below. Let the world know that you are finally reclaiming your power, and that you are entirely done letting toxic people bankrupt your soul. Please take a brief moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of true justice and personal empowerment. Your vital support allows these messages to reach men and women across the country who are still trapped in the dark shadows of manipulation, waiting for the courage to stand up and fight back. I read every single response personally, so please drop a comment and let me know which state you are watching this video from today and what time it is on your clock. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Stay incredibly strong, protect your boundaries, and never forget that you define your own worth.